To say that it's been a trying few weeks would be an understatement. I've seen some things I can't explain. I've seen my home invaded by things that I never really believed in. I've played host to forces outside my control, and I paid the price. It brought us closer, my brother and I, and closed a gap that I don't even think I really knew existed. Even so, I'm not sure what kind of psychological damage I may have done to him in the process. If I had known how this would have turned out, I would never have let him come stay with me. I work on a farm in northeastern part of Iceland. I'm not originally from here. I grew up in a small town out of Wales, but I was a bit of an overachiever. When my school offered me a chance to study abroad, I took it. My dad raised sheep, also some cows, and had a little farm of his own, so agriculture had seemed the right way to go when my studies became more refined. My professor assured me that the things I could learn in Iceland would help better my farming prospects in Wales. That was all Dad needed to hear. He paid the fees and wished me luck on my travels. When I came back after a year in Iceland, Dad was already sick with cancer, and I was already sick with grief for the beauty of the Icelandic countryside. When he died a year later, I took over the farm and finished high school. Davin was 3, barely off the tit, and no use at chores yet. Mom had spent the year that Dad had been sick curled up in a bottle, and she never really crawled back out. It was up to the hands and me to manage the farm. For the next 3 years, we sure as hell tried. Mom, however, had no interest in raising sheep or growing crops. Dad had always been strict, old-fashioned, and had certain expectations for our mother. With him gone, she fell in with less than admirable folks who spent Dad's life insurance and any other money he had left. Mom sold the sheep, sold the cows, and when she began to sell the land, I decided it was time to go. The hands had left by then. Mom hadn't paid them in months, and I offered to take Davin, but she refused. She took him into Cardiff to stay with a girlfriend of hers, and I took the money I had saved and went back to Iceland. I hadn't heard from her since, and I suppose I would never have heard from Davin again if Mom's girlfriend hadn't called me. I'd spent the last 3 years working at Frights and Winter Chills, working as a shepherd and training under Ulf to be a breeder. The farm was where I had lived when I was there on my work-study program, Ulf and I being about the same age, and when I called him to ask if they needed a hand, his father had invited me back with open arms. I knew a thing or two about sheep and cows, but Icelandic livestock are a little bit different. The climate can be unforgiving, and I had a lot to learn about taking care of animals in that kind of place. His father, Arnar, had been having trouble keeping hands for some reason. When he realized I meant to stay, he set me up on the property and said he considered me part of his family. I never pined for Wales. This was where I wanted to be, and I spent the next 3 years working my fingers to the bone and loving every minute of it. When Tetrick came to get me in the field one day, saying someone was calling about my mother, I figured that she had died. I was not so lucky as it turned out. When I picked up the phone, the caller identified herself as Tamara and told me that my mother had run off. My mother and brother had lived with Tamara since they had moved to Cardiff, and my mother owed Tamara quite a bit of money. Tamara would have thrown her out, but she felt sorry for Davin and let my mom mooch off of her. That was over now, though. My mom was gone, and Davin had been left behind. She couldn't keep him, she wasn't set up for that, and she had somehow tracked me down so I could decide whether I wanted to take my brother in or not. I looked at Ulf, who was hovering not too far away, and told him the situation. He told me that of course my brother was welcome here, and I told Tamara to set about the process of getting him here. A week later, I went to pick him up at the airport. He didn't run to me. He didn't even recognize me. He was sullen and confused, a 9-year-old whose world has crumbled beneath him like bad ice. He had a single duffel bag with clothes that would barely handle the cold inside the airport, let alone out on the step. It was December and freezing, so our first step was to get him some proper clothes. He never complained through the process, but neither was he excited. He simply seemed to accept what was happening and get through it. As we rode back to the farm, I smiled at him from across the seat. "Good thing you've got some new clothes there. We wouldn't want the Yule cat to get you," I joked. He cocked his head. "Yule cat? Is that like a dangerous creature or something?" I didn't think of it then, but I realize now that it was the first thing he had said to me since he told me bye when he was 6. I laughed. "It's just a story they tell around here, Lily Broder. The Yule cat comes around Christmas time, or Yule, I suppose, around these parts. He eats kids that don't have new clothes." Why would he do that?" Davin asked, interested but still a little nervous about the prospect of a giant cat that roamed around eating people. "It's something from the old times. They have all kinds of things like that around here. Does Father Christmas come here?" he asked, as if hoping for a little normalcy. "I suppose he must. He goes everywhere, doesn't he?" I said. I put a little Cockney spin on it. Davin smiled. Will he come visit us, you think?" I smiled at him, clearly taking the bait. "Of course he will. We'll get a tree and some stockings, and I bet Father Christmas will leave you all kinds of things this year." That was the 10th of December, my brother's first day in Iceland. I wouldn't officially start my journal for 2 more days, but I thought I should take this part down to preface it so that you would know that we started out well enough. We got him home and got him settled. He had his own room, something he wasn't used to. It was a little more than a storage closet with a bed and a dresser, but the things he'd brought with him looked small in that arguably small room to start with. I had told Ulf that I was taking a few days to make sure that he was settled into his new home, and we spent the first night catching up as the fire burned and we drank mugs of hot chocolate. He talked about living in Cardiff with Mom, how he'd gone to school and made friends while she partied every night and came home drunk when she came home at all. Tamara often went with her, and Davin usually found himself home alone. It was scary at first, being alone in a new place by yourself, but he'd gotten used to it. "I wanted to call you at first, but Mom didn't have your number. She said you'd abandoned us, and it wouldn't do any good to call you anyway. You had found a new family, and didn't need us anymore." His voice sounded hurt as he said it, and I gave him a little hug as we sat on my lumpy old couch. "I hope you know that wasn't so. I came here to escape Mom, but I didn't forget about you, kiddo." He smiled. I know that. Things had gotten better once he started going to school. He had a place to be and things to do. Mom never really had any money, so most of his clothes were charity stuff. Some of the kids made fun of him for it, too. Some of them didn't care. His mates, Davy and Franklin, had been charity kids, too, and the 3 of them had spent their afternoons grubbing for pocket money or playing in one of the parks near the apartment complex. Davy's uncle was the foreman at the cannery, and sometimes he'd pay us to run errands. Mostly it was picking up pop or dinner for the boys that worked his shift. Sometimes it was petrol for this machine or that. He always paid us pretty well. Davy said he felt sorry for Davy's mom, so he paid Davy a little to take some of the burden off her. That must have been rough, being on your own so often. Davin shrugged. It was what it was. Can't change it now. Then Mum had gone missing, and that had been the end of that. "She'll be back," Davin said sourly. "She owes too much money to her boyfriend. I heard them talking real loud outside one day about it. She'll lie low until he forgets, and then she'll come back to Tamara's. She did the same thing a couple of years ago, except not quite for this long." I let him do most of the talking to get it off his chest, and he went to bed in the wee hours of the morning after his yawns had got louder and longer. I hugged him goodnight, his sheets and bedspread brand new, and he was out before I closed the bedroom door. December 11th. I woke Davin up early and got him some breakfast. Then we went to town to find a Yule tree. Wild trees aren't particularly common, so we had to go to a tree lot and pay a scalper's price for what amounted to a stunty little fir. The tree wouldn't have done for a posh loft in Wales, but it would serve our needs just fine. We got some ornaments for it, too, and drove back, with the truck bed full of decorations. Davin was in fine spirit as we rolled along, and I made a note to come back to the truck later that evening for gifts I had picked up when he wasn't looking. Father Christmas would definitely be stopping by this year. Arnar was mending a fence near the house when we pulled up, and came over to see what we'd found in town. He grinned, his smile missing a few teeth, and said we'd found ourselves a fine Yule tree. "Hopefully it'll be bright enough to attract the attention of Father Christmas," Davin said, as he took the ornaments and lights out of the back of the truck. "Oh, it's not Father Christmas you'll have to worry about, lad. It's the Yule lads you'll be contending with." "Yule lads?" Davin asked, clearly confused. "Are they elves or something?" Arnar laughed, and it seemed to rumble his whole body. "You haven't heard of the Yule lads, boy," he said, hefting the tree from me and taking it towards the house. "They're supposed to be mischievous little pranksters," I said, as I picked up the last few packages and followed. "There are 13 of them, I think, each of them appearing on a different day that leads up to Christmas. Aren't they supposed to be goblins or something, sir?" I asked Arnar. He set the tree down in the living room and nodded. "Trolls, more like. They cause all sorts of mischief, but are supposed to leave gifts behind, too. It's all in good fun. Did Ulf tell you about tonight?" I shook my head. "Nay, haven't seen him today. Tanis has come down with a bug. Got him running out of both ends. He needs you to watch the flock tonight." I looked at Davin. "Will you be okay on your own tonight?" He nodded, but Arnar wouldn't hear of it. "Take him with you. If he's going to stay, he might as well get used to this life. Besides, it's just watching sheep." He told me to meet Goff down at the sheds at sundown, and I told him I'd be there. Guess we better get decorating. Sounds like we got some work tonight. We set about decorating the tree, and soon had the lights up and the glass balls hanging merrily from the branches. Davin really came out of his shell as the ornaments went up, and his eyes sparkled the way that a 9-year-old's should. The dour boy seemed to have gone for now, and he was laughing and smiling as we trimmed the tree. Father Christmas would be hard-pressed to miss it, and I made a mental note to wrap the gifts before it snuck up on me. As I stood with him, taking it all in, I felt for sure that this would be a Christmas we'd never forget. On that note, I was right. December 12th. Stekkjorstår. That night was the first night, and the first time I'd ever even seen one of them. My brother and I were out in the sheep shed, warm amongst the flock. Sheep are pretty important out here, and at the farm, they make up most of our livelihood. We got cows, 2 of them at least, and we were making strides with what Ulf called hothouse growing, but the sheepfold was still their biggest priority. Iceland really doesn't have any predators, but sheep are not what you'd call the smartest creatures. My presence here was to make sure that one of them didn't wander off into the middle of the night and freeze to death out in the cold. Sheep seemed to be continuously looking for a way to accomplish this. A hole in the wall or a separation between the dirt floor and the wall to scoot under. That's why they need to be watched. We had arrived just before sunset and found Goff standing out smoking a cigarette. He hailed us and I introduced him to Davin. Davin was bundled up in his new scarf, mittens, thermal cap, and his heavy jacket that made him look a little like a turtle as he peeked through the gap. Goff asked him how he was liking Iceland, and Davin told him it was great. I was glad to hear him say it, but then Goff confided in me that we were here for more than to watch the flock tonight. "It's Gertrude. Her time is close. You need to make sure she delivers okay." I nodded and told him that it shouldn't be a problem. This was far from my first time whelping lambs. Gertrude was a ewe with many seasons behind her, who had added many lambs to the herd in her time. She was getting ready to pop any day now, and Arnar wanted her to be watched, so we could get the lambs dry and sheltered if they decided to have them out in the field. The lambs would be weak when they were born, and the wind could kill a man without proper clothes, much less a little lamb. I was sitting next to her now, Davin petting her as he tried to stay awake. The trusting old thing had her head on my knee, and as the mounds of cotton clouds slumbered around us, she seemed to be the only one that was still awake. It was nearly 2 a.m, the wind howling outside like an angry cat, and I smiled at Davin when I looked over to see him snoozing. He was curled up underneath his new coat, the blanket he was sitting on keeping the worst of the floor off his pants, and he was leaning against one of the woolly rams, which was leaning against him in return. The two seemed to be companionable, and I shook my head as my own eyes got heavy. I shook awake pretty quick when I heard the sound of metal being pushed up, but I assumed it was the wind at the time. "Damn wind! Gotta find that hole before the sheep do," I muttered, getting to my feet. I shifted Gert, the old ewe making a soft sound of complaint, as I laid her head on the ground and started making my way through the sleeping sheep to find the hole. I didn't have to look far. A chorus of upset bleating led me to the opening in the wall, and I saw that the wind had pushed it up a bit. The howling menace was still shoving at the end as I pulled it back into place, pushing it back into place as I heaped some dirt on it to keep it down. The sheep quieted then, more concerned with the cold air getting in than anything else, and settled in so they could get back to sleep. I noticed, though, that there was something strange about the hole when I got in close. The metal siding wasn't separated at a corner like I had thought. The metal had a jagged cut in it, like someone had used a knife or something to cut into the side of the sheep shed. I thought about sheep thieves first, but why would they make such a small hole if they meant to steal sheep? The hole that had been cut was barely large enough for a child, and the weather was far too brutal for any children to be out in it. I swept my light around the shed. I didn't expect to find anything, but I still needed to look. The sheep were snuggled together, shuddering a little as my light danced over their closed eyes, and it was a little like looking through a cloud bank. They had to be 150 sheep in the shed, and they were packed together so tightly that I had no clue what I was expecting to find. That was, until my light fell on a hat in the midst of them. It was a tall red hat, like what a gnome might wear in a children's story. It was patched and dirty, and despite it being just a hat, it almost felt like it was looking at me. I felt my flashlight shake a little as I held it on that pointy hat, wondering if it was on a sheep or just what the hell it was sticking on. It was probably a trick. Ulf liked to play pranks, and I would make my way over there to find a ratty old hat stuffed onto an orange cone or something. I wanted to walk right over to it and prove that it was nothing special. I wanted to part the sheep and feel silly when I discovered that it was just Ulf making mischief. But I couldn't move. I had instructed my feet to move, but they remained where they were. The sheep slept peacefully around me, and it seemed like the world belonged to me in this strange red hat. The light beam hung there, bringing me to this oddity, and I somehow didn't like that any better. I wanted to turn the light off, breaking that bond between us, but I knew I didn't dare. That would leave me alone in the dark with the wearer of that hat. When the hat moved, I took a shaky step backward. My bum hit the metal wall, and I was aware suddenly that I was trapped by the walls and the sleeping sheepfold all around me. I looked back and found that the hat was moving towards me. It came on easily amongst the sheep, a hollow thumping noise following with it. As it came closer and closer to me, I looked for an escape, but I was blocked in on all sides. Thump, thump, thump. It was moving methodically towards me, the distance barely 20 feet as it cut through the soft clouds. Thump, thump, thump. I lunged to the left, but the sheep before me only bleated and turned away as I bumped him. Thump, thump, thump. She was a big, solid ewe, fat and ready for slaughter, but right now, she might as well have been a boulder as I tried to shove between her and another sheep. Thump, thump, thump. The hat bobbed about as it came closer, the owner of it sounding like he was on crutches or had a fake leg or something. Thump, thump, thump. Why would something so small have a fake leg? Thump, thump, thump. What could it possibly want with me? Thump, thump, thump. I put my hands up in fear, casting the light over my face as it came within a foot of me, and readied my foot for a kick if it came any closer. That's when I heard the loud bleating of a sheep in distress. It was from the direction I had come, back towards old Gertrude and my brother, and the hat wearer stopped at the sound. We both stood inches apart, me too scared to point the light down and see what was standing there, and the creature too intrigued by the noise. When I heard my brother yelling my name from the direction of the commotion, I stiffened, afraid the hat might start heading in his direction. He said the sheep was having babies, and I needed to help him because he didn't know what he was doing. I turned back towards the thing, but the flashlight beam showed me that the hat was gone. I started jostling my way through the sheep as I made my way back to my brother's side. As I came upon them, he was sitting with Gertrude, his new coat used to warm the 3 squishy-looking lambs. They were bleeding and shivering, and I grabbed for the stack of towels we kept not far off. Gertrude was still pushing them out, her own bleeding loud and pained, and as a 4th fell to the cold dirt, Davin and I started drying them off, rubbing the warmth into their wet little bodies, as Gertrude licked at the 4th one, trying to warm him up. 4 was uncommon for a lambing, but Gertrude was a pro. She sat amongst her new lambs after we'd warmed them up and licked them as she shared her warmth. I looked down at the little guy I was cleaning and sucked in a breath as I laid him with the others. The lamb had eyes like milk, and one of his legs was bent oddly. Gert cleaned him, the poor little creature baaing pathetically, but she pushed him away when he tried to suckle. The other 3 drank greedily as the 4th wandered away, towards the other sleeping sheep looking for suck. That was odd for Gertrude. Usually she was very motherly, and I couldn't miss the sad look on her face as she watched the little lamb wobble away. My brother had gone back to sleep, his head pressed against the slimy jacket, and I reached out for the blind lamb as I sat back to watch Gertrude feed them. She bleated at me, seeming to tell me to let it be, but I picked it up and drew it close anyway. Arnar would decide what to do with it in the morning, and if it died, it wouldn't be any fault of mine. Gertrude lay back, seeming to look at me disapprovingly, as she settled back to sleep while the sheep suckled. I yawned and patted the blind lamb, feeling it shiver as it tried to nurse against my jacket, and with each stroke of its soft skin, I felt myself getting sleepier and sleepier. I woke up face to face with a nightmare. The thing had its squashed nose about an inch from my face, the familiar red hat sagging a little atop its lumpy head. Its scabby beard was damp, and I realized with horror that it had been drinking milk. I looked at Gertrude, but the 3 lambs were still there, and her eyes were sad and on me. The thing was still looking at me, grumbling in a huffy little voice as its eyes bored into mine. He could only be one thing, but he looked very different from the posters and books I'd seen of them. They always made them look like little Father Christmases, with their red coats and white beards and jolly demeanor, mischievous in their own way as they went about the holiday. They had reminded me of the dwarves from Snow White when I'd seen them, and I laughed at the thought of these little creatures sneaking about my house and leaving gifts. This thing looked nothing like a dwarf or a Father Christmas. Its skin was the color of oatmeal. It was lumpy and covered with a screed of mangy hair, its coat looking more muddy than red. It had a long knife in its belt, and its horny foot looked black and bloated, save for the wooden one. This one had to be Strekjastor, called Stumpy in English, the first to come, and he was always kind of funny looking when they drew him. He had a wooden leg, sometimes 2, and he stumped about as he tried to steal sheep's milk from the teat. He didn't seem funny at all now. As he left, I noticed that he had the blind lamb in his hands, and I heard the sheep mutter unhappily as he moved between them. Before I could find my nerve, he was gone. That's where Arnar found me a few hours later, still frozen by fear and staring out into the mass of sheep. He looked at Davin before he asked, "You see him?" I nodded, not bothering to pretend I didn't know what he was talking about. He only nodded. "Ugly bastard, ain't he?" "You've seen him too?" I asked, flabbergasted. Arnar nodded, looking at Gertrude as she and her lambs slept. "Had a late batch of lambs once myself, when I was no older than your brother there. Da sent me to sit with them that night. That was the night that Gertrude was born, she and her 4 brothers. She was small, a shivering thing, and her mother would not suckle her. I tried to make her, but she just looked at me sadly and pushed old Gert away. That night, he came for her. I saw his little hat first, making its way through the sheep, but my Da had told me what he really was, and I was little more prepared than you. I picked up a pitchfork and held my ground. I wouldn't let that little puddin'-head bastard near my Gert. He eventually took one of the others and left. Gert's mother let her suckle after that, and Gertrude grew up to be the best sheep in the flock." He bent and stroked the old ewe, and she leaned her head up to reciprocate. "Was it lame?" he asked. I nodded, and blind. "And male?" he asked, eliciting a second nod. "Then he's done us a favor. Only the strong survive up here, as well you know." He came back a few hours later with breakfast and a new coat for Davin. I told him I'd pay him for it, but he brushed it off. Arnar said he had done a fine job of birthing 3 strong sheep, and that he ought to have something for it. Davin looked confused. I thought there were 4. I shook my head. "He died in the night, kiddo. Guess he wasn't cut out for it." We fixed the hole in the shed later that day. I wish that was my last encounter with the Yule lads, but since he was only the first, you know that isn't so. December 13th, Giljagur. What a night. I got some sleep after last night's excitement, but Davin apparently got up early to help Ulf with some minor chores. I woke up at 4 to the sound of a snowball hitting my living room window, and looked out to see Davin and Ulf laughing as they roused me from sleep. Davin looked a little sorry when I came out, dressed in my heavy coat and my snow pants, but Ulf looked unrepentant as he grinned through his neat red beard. "Couldn't let you sleep all day, Frady," he said, using the Icelandic word for cousin. "I suppose not. I'll have to remember that while you're trying to sleep tonight and I'm up with the sheep again. Perhaps you can join me in the sheep shed after I pelt your window with some snow." He laughed hugely and socked me in the arm. "Go ahead and try. You'll have an easier time waking a hibernating bear." He invited me to come have some dinner, and we walked off towards his father's house, the smells of a meal already on the wind. As we walked, Ulf let Davin get a little ahead of us and spoke his mind. "Da said you had an encounter with Stekjastor last night." I didn't look at him while we walked, not wanting him to see how unsettled I was. "Did he now?" "He did. He said he stole your lamb. If you're looking for a house pet, I'm sure we could get you another one," he joked, clapping me on the back. I shook my head. Have you ever seen one, Ulf?" Ulf snorted. "A lamb? They're usually everywhere, as you know." I didn't return his mirth. "You know what I mean." Ulf shook his head, and I could see him look away uncomfortably. "Da says they ain't like the stories. We make them look like Dvorger, but that isn't how they are. He says you're lucky to be alive. They don't usually take kindly to people not of the land." I made a rude noise and pushed him into a snowdrift. "Then you're lucky you've never seen one. They'd probably mistake you for a female, and you'd have to explain to your da why you married a troll." He came up spitting snow but grinning, and I raced him to the house as he tried his best to dump snow down my jacket. That night, however, I wished I hadn't joked about the Yule lads. I was back in the sheep shed again. Davin was set to chores the next morning with Ulf, so I was on my own. I was surprised how quickly Davin had taken to Ulf, but I wasn't disappointed either. If Davin was my brother by blood, then Ulf was my brother by choice. The two of us had become very close over the years, and I was glad that he was teaching Davin the ropes. I would have liked to have Davin tonight, though, so he could help me keep watch against the red-hatted little boogin. I knew that the lads would come back every night for 13 nights, and I knew that Strixtastor would be back for another drink of milk, or maybe another lamb. I sat with Gert, her lambs thriving and trying their shaky legs under her watchful eye. I kept a quiet eye on them. The night passed on, the wind a little quieter, and it turned out to be a pretty peaceful evening. I could feel my eyes trying to slide shut as the soft breathing of the sheep echoed through the shed. No mysterious red hat appeared. No doors were cut in the metal. And as my watch beeped 4 a.m., I got up and stretched my legs a little. I stepped outside, hoping that the wind would wake me up, and pulled my coat up as I took it in the face. The moon was edging around, and dawn would be here soon. When I stepped out of the shed, I was thinking of nothing so much as snuggling under my blankets and falling asleep. But that was before I saw the minuscule figure sneaking across the snow and into the cow barn. Sheep may be relatively plentiful around Icelandic countrysides, but cows were definitely a luxury that not everyone could afford. Arnar owned 2 cows, and I knew for a fact that he had bought them at a high personal cost. He liked the taste of sheep's milk all right, but nothing beat a tall glass of cow's milk in the morning, he would often say. He sold the excess in town for a premium, and fed them a special grain to make the sweet cream he loved. The thought of Strekjastor making off with one of Arnar's prized cows was unthinkable. I closed up the shed, making my way slowly towards the cow barn. I wanted to surprise him, if I could, and not catch that sharp little knife in the leg if I couldn't. The snow crunched softly under my feet, and I tried to quiet my steps, aware that any sound might thwart me. The door was ajar when I made my way to the cow barn, and I could hear a soft, angry mooing as I went in. The 2 cows, Rajma and Jmolk, were standing in their stalls, but Rajma was making quite a stir as something small and hairy moved beneath its udders. It was milking the cows, but its hands were moving like the heddles of a loom, going up and down much too fast. The cows were stamping and huffing, but the creature seemed to take no notice of it as it filled the buckets. As it finished, it moved the buckets down a little and slid that cruel knife out as it cut the cow along its flank. The cow surged forward, bawling loudly, but not before a freshet of blood fell into the bucket, turning the milk a frothy pink. For some reason, my mind went to the strawberry milk mix I had used as a kid, and my gorge threatened to rise up and cover the straw. His eyes locked on me as he picked up the full bucket, slurping at the foam on top as it headed for the door. It grinned through its crooked teeth, and I saw that it was not the same one as yesterday. This one must have been Giljagor. He wore a red pair of overalls that barely contained his gut. A similar knife stuck through his belt as it bulged around his middle. His spindly arms seemed to hold the bucket with ease, his other hand sliding the blade over his tongue as he cleaned the cow's blood from it. A similar red hat sat on his head, and his beard was more akin to the foam as he slurped it from the bucket. His eyes seemed to dare me to do something, and when the cow bucked in its stall, I looked away for a little too long. He was gone when I looked back, bucket and all. Arnar arrived at dawn as I finished patching up Rajmar. The cut hadn't been too bad. It had been long and jagged, but not too deep. I could see old scars that I had never really thought too much about, but now made a lot more sense. Giljagor had done this before, many times, and knew just how deep to cut, so he didn't miss his treat. He couldn't come back for more if he killed the cow, after all. What a sick little game it had here. "Have you checked the sheep yet?" Arnar asked, guessing what I would find when I did. There was a hole in the shed, not much bigger than the one the night before. I counted them and found we were missing one. It had been a small ram, barely out of its summer coat, and Ulf and Davin found what was left of it later that day by the fence line. The 2 had eaten well, it would seem, and Ulf found a bucket not far from the ram. There was frozen milk in it, frozen and red. Arnar had nodded. Won't be the first of such sacrifices. He gave me the night off, saying Davos could take the watch tonight and tomorrow night. His kindness, however, did not change the itinerary of the lads in the least bit. December 14th. Stuffer. I rose around noon to find Davin in the living room reading a book. "No chores today?" Davin looked up and smiled. "Ulf said that there was nothing pressing for me to do today, and so I should take the day off." I laughed. That sounded like Ulf. "Have you eaten?" "Breakfast, yes, but as for lunch, no." "Well, how about I make you some lunch? I'm pretty hungry myself." He hopped up and followed me to the kitchen, clearly liking the idea. I opened the fridge, looking around for groceries and seeing a gaping hole that made me furrow my brow. I had put leftovers in the fridge from the night before that were suddenly gone. I had put some scree and rye in the icebox, thinking it would make a nice lunch when I got up, but suddenly it was gone. The loaf of bread on the counter was also nowhere to be seen, and I marveled at the boy's appetite. As he came walking in, I looked at my little brother, trying to keep the scowl off my face as he moved up beside me. "Got a little hungry last night, did you?" His look of confusion put me off. "What do you mean? There's a whole meal's worth of leftovers missing. And did you have to eat a whole loaf of bread? I had meat and cheese in the fridge you could have put with it." He shook his head and looked baffled. I didn't eat any of that. I assumed you came in hungry and had some food." Now, I was as confused as he was. "No, but if you didn't eat the food, who did?" I asked him if Ulf had been in the house, figuring he was the source of my missing food. The big Icelander was usually a bottomless pit, and I'd heard his mother bemoaning her grocery bill more than once. Ulf took after his forebears, a big muscled Nordic bruiser, though more prone to smiles than scowls, and he could clean out a pantry all on his own. Davin said he had come in, but only for a few minutes. I went to the bathroom and came back to find him gone. I nodded, understanding who had eaten my leftovers. I loved Ulf like a brother, but he could certainly be trying sometimes. "Well, I suppose we should go see if Sigrun has anything we can eat for lunch." Davin hadn't met Sigrun yet, and I smiled as I remembered my first meeting with the woman. I had been 16 and away from home for the first time. Ulf had taken to me immediately, calling me cousin and bringing me into his games, and Arnar had warmed me quickly when he realized I was no pampered Welsh brat. Sigrun, however, had been my first real comfort when I arrived. Arnar was gruff but fair, and Ulf was a little more energetic than I strictly liked in a stranger. Sigrun and her cats, and her kitchen full of good smells and warm meals, became a place that I could go when I was feeling homesick or needed a moment to breathe. She must have sensed this because she treated me like a lost lamb that needed to be fattened up so I could survive the cold winters. Within a month, I was thick as thieves with Ulf, his energy having rubbed off on me, and Sigrun's kitchen remained a place that I sought refuge from time to time. Arnar's longhouse always looked a little odd as it sat cheek and jowl with his very English-looking barn. We came around the back, and as I walked into the very familiar kitchen, I heard Sigrun humming as she fixed lunch. She smiled when she saw us, wrapping me in a hug that I couldn't help but return. Sigrun had always reminded me of the wife character from David the Gnome, her round face made for smiling and her skirts always homemade, covered by a thick apron. She was short and round and always had a smile and some food for me or her hungry son when we came in from work. She offered Davin a hug, and to my surprise he took it. Our mother had never been a big hugger, but it seemed that Davin felt the same warmth that I had on my first visit. She sat us at her table and fixed us some lamb stew from a pot on the stove, asking if her husband paid me so poorly that I couldn't keep food in the house for a growing boy. It was said in jest, and I took no offense. Growing indeed, but it appears that my pantry was raided by a hungry bear last night. I woke up to find my leftovers missing, and a whole loaf of bread, too. She laughed. "Sounds like you've been visited by Stuffer, or by Ulf, more likely," she said, as she put down rye bread and cheese as well. "Is he one of the Yule lads?" Davin asked, and Sigrun ruffled his hair. "He certainly is. He's short, and he eats the crusts of bread left over in the pans. He often takes the pans, too. Were you missing any of those?" I shook my head, slurping up the savory stew. "I haven't checked yet. I was more worried about my leftovers. He doesn't come till tonight, though, right?" She nodded. "Better lock up your leftovers after dark, or see them gone by the likes of that rogue." "Does he bother you much?" I asked, seeing her gleaming cookware hanging from the ceiling. "Some, but Siegfried usually runs the lads off." She smiled at the fat ginger cat sitting by the fire. "He always keeps the Yule lads from making too much mischief." The fat Tom was sleeping peacefully on the hearth as she bustled about, opening a sleepy eye every now and again when someone got too close. Even by the standards of house cats, Siegfried was a big one. He was 50 pounds of ginger tomcat, and he had sired many kittens in his time. Most of them still lingered about the house or the yard, but they all paid their respects to Siegfried when he happened to be looking for a sunny spot to sleep. "I could use a fine cat like that," I commented, feeling Frigg rub against my leg before bending down to pet her. "Well, why don't you borrow one of his litter? I'm sure Grendel would be happy to stay with you through the holidays," she joked. I looked over at the lean, black Tom, currently stalking one of his brothers, and made an uncertain noise. Grendel had earned that name fairly. He was an angry cat with a savage disposition, and he didn't like anyone. The cat tolerated Sigrun, because he knew that any slight to her would be answered by Siegfried's swiping paw or Arnar's stiff work boots. But I didn't like the idea of trying to transport that little terror to my house. My arms would be bloody ribbons before I made it to the midway point, and I started to decline. Davin, however, made the point moot. He walked over to the black Tom, and the cat looked up with surprise. No one came near Grendel if they could help it. He was unpredictable, and I was shocked when the cat didn't immediately hiss at him. The dark shade watched Davin approach, uncommonly quiet as he reached down to pick him up. I was expecting violence, the hurt yells of my brother when the cat scratched him, but he lifted him into his arms as easy as any cat within the house. I tensed, expecting him to get a swipe for surprising the angry beastie, but Grendel only stiffened a little before melting into my brother's arms with a loud purr. Sigrun looked as surprised as I was when Davin came back to the table, Grendel cradled in his arms like a baby. Well, it appears I've seen everything now. I reached a shaky hand over to see what sort of Christmas miracle this was. When Grendel hissed and swiped at me, I knew he hadn't had too strong a change of heart. Davin carried Grendel home with us an hour later, the sooty devil hanging from his arm like a living shadow. I glanced at the Tom mistrustfully as Davin carried him inside. I didn't know what to expect from Grendel, besides having my ankles swiped from under any surface he decided to hide beneath, and made a mental note to wear boots inside for a while. Whether or not he could help against the lads, I didn't know, but I was willing to find out. The rest of the evening went about as well as expected. Davin and I watched some TV, Davin enjoying the local shows, though he wasn't yet fluent in Icelandic. Grendel sat on his lap the whole time, seeming to be taken with my little brother. I asked him how he had managed to charm the little creature, and Davin just shrugged. He petted the cat absent-mindedly, and this was the calmest I had ever seen the temperamental feline. I've always been good with cats. At home, I could get even the meanest alley cats to come for a pet. It's a gift, I guess. I nodded, looking down at the purring Grendel and agreeing. When bedtime came, the cat snuggled down with Davin, a pair of green eyes floating in the darkness. I locked eyes with him for a moment, and it was clear that he wouldn't let anything happen to my brother as he slept. I started to close the door, but I left it cracked instead after remembering why the Tom was here. He would need to get out if something came lurking tonight, and lurking it came. I slid into my own bed as the living room clock struck 10, wanting my own sleep if I was going to work again tomorrow night. I was awakened later that night by a loud clang from the kitchen, the sound of cookware sliding noisily out of my cupboard. It sounded as if someone had come looking for more than bread crusts. I sighed as I realized the cat was going to be no help. I grabbed the walking stick I had used for hikes and started making my way up the dark hall. From the kitchen, I could hear the clang of pans as they fell from the cabinet, and a low chuckle that crept under the bangs. I held the stick between my hands, preparing to swing as I came around the corner. If I swept low, I might manage to sweep him in a rush, maybe even catch a few if they were all here. Peeking around the corner, my eyes adjusting to the darkness, I could see a small back as it rifled through the pans in my open cupboard. He was a small one, smaller than either of the others I'd seen, and looked barely over 3 feet tall. It was naked, except for a covering of metal over its bits and its chest, It clattered a little as it moved, the pans strung across him with twine or metal strands, and they bumped against the cookware as he rustled against them. I crept into the kitchen, the little creature too intent on his pilfering to take any notice of me as I slunk in. I had the stick raised, ready for a strike, but the thing suddenly spun to glower at me, freezing me in place with an angry glare. God, it was so ugly. It looked like a potato that some child had carved badly, using a spoon or something blunt. I couldn't move, the little thing holding me in place as easy as it held my muffin tin. But it appeared that someone else didn't have the same problem. From behind the little thing, I could see a pair of green eyes as Grendel prepared to leap. Grendel hit him hard in the center of the back, sending him to the ground with a clatter of cookware. The little troll yowled and tried to roll away, but the cat dogged his heels relentlessly. I kept my stick up, wanting to swing now that my fear had passed, but not wanting to smack the cat in the process. The two rolled, Stuffer swinging his little club arms at the cat as he squealed like a trapped rat. Stuffer pushed him off suddenly, and I saw my chance. I swung the staff like a hockey stick and watched the little creature spin away into the living room. Stuffer squealed as he pelted into the dark room, and Grendel glowered at me as if to say, "Great, now I have to catch him again." We both lit out after him, listening intently as we stalked him. My eyes scanned the dark living room, trying to find any sound that might give the little hellion away. He was covered in metal, for God's sake. How hard could he be to find? Grendel's ears flicked, hearing something slight, and he leapt towards the couch. Stuffer made a squeaky sound, scampering out from behind the couch, and bumped into the end table as he looked to see if the cat was behind him. I lost them for half a second, and then there was a yowl and a scrambling of tiny feet. Grendel skidded on the carpeted floor as he chased the incredibly fat little creature. It wobbled as it ran, obese but still quick on those stubby legs, and I could see that it now had the knife in its tiny hand. It was little better than a sewing needle in the creature's little grip, but I didn't want the cat to get hurt as it tried to protect us. Grendel hunched, ready to pounce, its tail swinging back and forth as it waited for just the right time. They were like gunfighters, standing ready to draw when the time was right, before my bumbling ass got involved again. I jumped and brought the stick down, both stumbling away as it came between them. Stuffer chuckled and lunged for the door, disappearing into the cold as it ran from this unwinnable situation. Grendel set his displeased eyes on me again, but I told him to go back to bed as I stomped to the door and locked it. The dark shadow went back to Davin's room, its tail flicking in agitation, and I went back to my own bed. It had been a long night, but it seemed that Grendel could hold his own against the nimble lad. As I drifted off, though, I wondered if he would fare so well against more of them, if they showed up in force. December 15th. Vrasliker. What small victory we'd had last night was squashed the next day. Arnor woke me up that morning to let me know that another sheep had gone missing. "One of Gertrude's 3 lambs. She is beside herself with grief," he said, and I could tell that the old farmer was as distraught as the ewe was. "The cows are hurt again. Both are injured, and their udders are so bruised that I don't dare to touch them. Doesn't matter anyway. Their milk is gone when I arrived." I shook my head. This isn't normal behavior from the lads. I remembered last year and wishing I'd paid more attention. The last few years had seen sheep and milk and things go missing, but never quite to this amount. I'd never actually believed in the Yule lads, no more than I'd believed in Father Christmas since I was small. But now that I'd seen them, it was harder to deny that they existed. Arnor nodded. "They take sheep sometimes. They take some milk, but this is not their usual trickery. Something is different this year. I don't like it. Did you have any trouble last night?" I nodded, but Grendel scared them off. Arnor snorted. "I still can't believe you got some use out of that angry little thing." "He really seems to like Davin. He's the only one I've ever seen who could pet him without getting scratched." Arnor smiled. "Then your brother is more than welcome to him. My Yule gift to him." I smiled, but Arnar laughed when he saw my trepidation. "Thanks so much. He's an angry one, to be certain, but he's a better mouser than any. He caught 10 fat rats in the barn on his own just last week. He'll be a good pet, once he's used to you, of course." He asked me if I could stay with the sheep that night, and I agreed that I would, confident in our new guardian and his ability to protect the house. That night, Grendel's skills would be put to the test. I came back inside and started making inroads on lunch, thinking that sandwiches might be the way to go. I remembered too late that Ulf had raided my pantry before Stuffer could, and made a list of things to get from the store. Davin came out about that time, rubbing his eyes and holding his new shadow. Grendel looked at me like I was the stupidest thing he'd ever seen, but he didn't hiss at me. When I reached to pet him, he swiped at me, but his claws were in and the swipe was lame. We were brothers in battle now, I supposed, but he still didn't care much for me. "Good morning. Any plans today?" Davin said, yawning. "I've got work tonight. Did Ulf have some chores for you?" "He said something about fixing a chicken coop this afternoon, but told me I didn't have to come till after lunch." "Sounds like you got some time for shopping with me then, but let's get some breakfast first." I opened the pot cabinet and grimaced when I saw that several of my pans were missing. I glowered at Grendel, seeing that Stuffer had come back after our little skirmish. The cat seemed to shrug as if to say, "Well, I had to sleep sometime, didn't I?" I didn't have more than a couple of pans to start with, but the loss was felt pretty widely when I couldn't make eggs or bacon without using the only pan I had left. It was huge, big enough to cook half a chicken in, and I set it on the stove and opened the utensil drawer to get a spatula. I pulled my hand back in disgust as I came down on something slimy on top of the spoons, shaking the thick coating of slime as Davin chuckled to himself. It had been covered in what felt like spit. I washed it, clearly feeling the presence of spoon licker's short appearance last night. A few of my ladles also bore the shiny skein of having been licked, but I doubted the little scamp got much more than dust off of them. Ulf often told me how horrible English cooking was, so I was careful not to make it worse by badly cleaned utensils. I cooked the bacon and eggs together, crisping them nicely as I added some of the hard bread I'd gotten from Sigrun yesterday. It soaked up the grease, and we ate our little meal before we headed to the market. I gave him a little money and told him we were going to buy some Christmas presents when we were here. He perked up, smiling as he took the roll of bills. Davin was excited by the idea of finally having someone to buy presents for, and the money to buy them with, and we had a morning of picking out gifts for Ulf, Arnar, and Sigrun. I picked up a few things for some of the other hands, and a few things for Davin, too. It was his first Christmas, and I wanted to make sure it was as memorable as possible. I also got him a very special gift for that night, something for my peace of mind as much as his. When I prepared to go that night, I gave him his early Christmas present and watched him grin from ear to ear. Now it's only for emergencies, and it won't make international calls if you were thinking about calling home, but it'll let you surf the web a little bit, and you can reach me in the sheep shed if there's an emergency. He smiled at me as he slid the new cell phone into his pocket. "Thanks, I promise not to abuse it." I ruffled his hair and grinned. "I'll be close by if you need me," and looked down at Grendel, who was warming Davin's legs. He seemed to nod at me, letting me know that he would keep an eye out, and I nodded back before setting off for the sheep shed. I didn't like leaving Davin alone, not with the house so active lately, but I could hardly turn down the work, and Davin might have to get used to a certain amount of independence here. Ulf met me outside the shed, a lumpy package under his arm. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, handing me the bag. "You want your Dawes cows protected, right?" He looked unsure. "The thing is, Friedy, no one has, to my knowledge, ever attacked one of the lads before. They're not like burglars or cow thieves. You can't turn them off with a warning shot. They're of the other world. Grendel ran 2 of them off last night. I don't see why a shot in the dark wouldn't do the same for this one." Ulf looked uncomfortable. "People who mess with the other world, the fairy world, never come out ahead. The lads take some, not usually this much, but some, and then they go. They leave us gifts for what they took, and we always have enough to give. Did you ask Da if this was okay?" I unzipped the bag and took out the hunting rifle and a little pouch of shells. It was nothing special, small bolt-action rifle, but they weren't large creatures we were talking about. I assumed that the bullets had trace amounts of iron in them, iron being historically poisonous to the creatures of Fae, so maybe it could work. If nothing else, it would dissuade them from coming back again, and save us a few nights of headache. No, but he told me to guard the sheep and the cows. I'm just doing what he told me to do. Be very careful with that thing. You don't have a gun license, and if someone gets hurt, Da will be blamed. I'll be careful. Get back inside before you freeze, I chuckled, throwing the bag over my shoulder. He shook his head. Good hunting, and stomped back towards the longhouse. I settled myself near the door to the sheep shed and kept an eye on the cow shed. I would have preferred to nestle myself amongst the sheep, taking advantage of their collective warmth, but I needed a clear view to the shed so I could see the little bastard making his way in. I had the rifle across my lap, sipping the coffee I'd brought in a thermos, and waiting for my prey to arrive. Gertrude was nowhere to be seen tonight. Arnar had moved her into the house after the second lamb had gone missing, and now she would be spending the holiday inside. She was likely curled up with the cats by the fire, while I was freezing my bollocks off out here with the door open. The sheep had moved away a bit, not liking the cold, and I was left leaning against the wall by myself. The night seemed to stretch on forever as I sat with the cold wind keeping me awake. I checked my phone a few times to make sure Davin hadn't called, but the lads must have kept away tonight, because I never heard from him. The sheep bleated angrily a few times as the wind whistled in briskly, but I pulled my muffler up over my face and kept my vigil. Near 4 a.m., I heard the phone go off, and it roused me from a doze. It was Davin, and I fumbled my glove off so I could answer it. Davin? Is everything all... You need to get back home! There's something in the kitchen! He was whispering, and I could hear Grendel hissing angrily. Is Grendel with you? Yeah, he wants out real bad, though. I peeked, and I could see 4 of them out there. 4? Not 5. That's when I saw the shadow making his way across the yard. I'll be there in a minute, Davin. I need to do something real quick. But I hung up on him. If I could hit this one, maybe the rest of them would leave on their own. By this point, the moon large and yellow, I could make out the pointed hat and the chunky sweater that they all seemed to wear. I would have worried that it was a child or something, if this weren't the middle of the night and near-freezing conditions. I took aim, seeing the ugly little thing as I put him between my crosshairs. I could still remember his milk mustache, his lumpy face that grinned with no particular fear when caught, and led him a little as I prepared to fire. I'd gone shooting with Arnar and Ulf more than once, and it was a fair shot with the comfortable old rifle. Suddenly he stopped and turned to look directly at me. You would have said that was impossible. I was 50 feet away and nearly buried in a snowdrift. But he looked at me. Even across the distance, I could feel those hateful eyes as they bore into me. It froze me, just as it had that night in the cowshed. The look, though, I couldn't have seen it, seemed to communicate easily his disdain for me. What will you do, man-thing? It seemed to challenge. You have no power here. You cannot hope to stand against the lads. I bet you won't even pull that trigger. He started to move again, and though I felt as though my bones had turned to ice, I squeezed the trigger as I attempted to recapture my tenuous manhood. My shot cracked out across the silent yard, and I heard the sheep and cows raise a ruckus as their world was filled with sound. I was off at once, crunching through the snow and running to the spot where I'd seen the little imp fall. I didn't actually believe I had killed it. I didn't honestly think it could be killed, but I wanted to see if it had left anything behind. Some hair, maybe, or blood, or anything that would prove I'd actually hit it. When I came to the spot, I heard people raising a ruckus in the longhouse, and it seemed nearly as loud as the cows and the sheep had. When I got to the spot, I saw 3 things sitting in a divot that it had left in the snow. A long piece of red string, a small amount of blackish blood, and a potato. I picked up the potato, looking at the odd withered thing, when I started hearing footsteps crunching towards me. I turned the rifle, still in hand, to find Arnar and Ulf, as well as 3 of the farmhands coming towards me. Arnar sucked in a breath when he saw the potato, and I heard him say something guttural when he noticed the blood. Ulf looked at his father, shocked, but he too seemed to be unsettled by the old root in my hand. Arnar reached for the rifle. "Give me the gun, boy. I can't believe you have done this thing with my own weapon." I was speechless for a few seconds as he snatched the rifle from my shaking hand. "Done what? I saw him coming to hurt the cows. I stopped him." "You stopped nothing," Arnar yelled. "You have only given him a more exclusive target. You have interrupted their holiday business, and now you will have to pay the price. I'm sorry, boy," he said, shaking his head and walking back towards the house. "What does that mean?" I asked him. But he only kept walking, the farmhands in tow. I looked at Ulf. "What does that mean?" Ulf shook his head. "It means you shouldn't have messed with the creatures of Fae. I told you it was a bad idea, Frady." The chill in my blood had nothing to do with the biting wind. Is he gonna send me away, Ulf?" Ulf shook his head. "He thinks of you as a son. He could never send you off, especially now that you have a mouth to feed. I think, though, that it might be best for you to take a few days off. Once the Yule lads are gone, you can come back to work. Till then, you might have your hands full. Too full for work, I should think." He tromped back to the house, leaving me in the snow to contemplate what I had done. December 16th, Pataskville. As bad as things had been, they were only about to get worse. I returned early that first morning to find all my pans, even the new ones I'd bought yesterday, my leftovers, my spoons, and my ladles missing. Just gone. I looked around, but they were nowhere to be found. Not only that, but there's frozen lamb missing from my freezer, and the coffee creamer in the refrigerator has been drunk and left empty for me to find. Left with a bloody handprint on the side of it. Davin was asleep, blinking groggily at me as I reminded him of the cell phone call. He said he had thought afterwards that it might have been a dream, and after the sun came up, he'd fallen back asleep. He had locked the door to keep Grendel inside, and he guessed to keep the things in the kitchen out. But he said again that he had thought it was a dream until I had said something about it. When I came in, the cat was sitting by the door, looking at me as though he were extremely disappointed in me for letting Davin lock him up like this. Davin was getting ready for the day as I let Grendel out, and I decided that some breakfast might be nice after the night I'd had. He came out as I was trying to cook eggs in a pot, something that wasn't going very well, and I told him to wait a few minutes and I'd send him off with a hot breakfast. "I'll be fine. I'll get something from the house before we get started." Ulf said he wanted me there bright and early to mend some fences in the east field. I had added grits to the eggs, both cooking a little better with the addition of water, when he came back inside looking unhappy. "Ulf told me to take the day off," he said. He sounded like he might be about to cry. "Any particular reason?" I asked, adding more eggs to the grits. "He said it would be better if I wasn't seen for a few days. Did you do something last night? Something that made everyone mad?" I told him to sit as I went to get another bowl. This was going to take some explaining. I told him what I'd seen in the cowshed, the lambs and the sheep that had gone missing, and the anger that I felt at having my house violated by these Yule lads. They had never done this before. Most years their pranks went unnoticed, and their gifts were something that I could have attributed to Ulf or Arnar, both men liking their holiday traditions. I had never really believed in the lads, no more than I'd believed in the damn Yule cat, but now that I'd seen them, it was hard to deny. I told Davin all this, told him how I felt powerless after letting them take Gertrude's sheep and hurt Arnar's cows. I told him how I had decided to do something about it and gotten Ulf to bring me his father's rifle. I told him how I had shot the Yule lad and how Arnar had become so wroth with me. After that, Davin seemed to understand. We spent the rest of the day talking and trying to figure out what we would do. Davin thought maybe we could set some traps and catch them if they came tonight. I wasn't so sure that they could be caught, and thought I might rather barricade us in one of the bedrooms and try to hold out for the night. It was just stuff, after all, and I could always replace it if they stole it. I knew I had done something wrong, knew I had meddled in things beyond my understanding, but still didn't like things coming into my house and taking my stuff. When I heard the knock at the door around dinner time, I wasn't exactly sure what to expect. Certainly not Sigrun with plates of food and a piteous smile. I figured you might have little to cook on by now, so I brought you something to raise your spirits. I took the plates, smiling thankfully. Does Arnar know you're here? She snorted. Of course. It was his idea as much as mine. He knows why you did what you did. But boy, you know how foolish it is to set yourself against Fae. What else could I do? They've never done anything like this before. A few sheep here and there, or some food or milk, but they've never been this active. This cannot stand. I made this place my home, and I don't like to see it mistreated. Do yourself a favor tonight, please, and lock yourself in. Ignore them. Let the lads have their mischief, and maybe they'll be content to leave after that. Promise me, she said, pleading as the plates sent up steam into the snowy air. I wanted to deny her, but I just couldn't bring myself to do that to my adopted mother. I will. Davin and I both, I promised, and she said goodnight so we could enjoy our hot meals. I came in to find Davin setting up little traps, Grendel looking on with curiosity. His traps were very McAllister-esque, and I was a little bit impressed. He had rigged up a fairly impressive tripwire, something I nearly found by accident, and was talking softly to Grendel about the toy cars he'd set up when I came back. He looked a little embarrassed when he saw me, and he perked up when I told him it looked good. It isn't much, but maybe we can set up some other things, too. Things to fall on them and things to hit them in the head. Maybe something to make them leave. Did Dad ever teach you how to make a rabbit snare? Maybe if we catch them, but I cut him off. Sorry, kiddo, but I think we'll be bunkering down tonight. Davin looked crestfallen. But why? Didn't you say you wanted to run them off? That was before I talked to Sigrun. She said it's best to just let them have their fun and leave again. He looked unhappy about this, but when I put a hand on his shoulder, he looked up at me with a little more confidence. Worry not, kiddo. Perhaps if we let them have their fun, they'll just leave us alone after that. If nothing else, it can only go on for a few more nights. Once we survive the holidays, we'll know better next year, and hope they don't hold a grudge. He nodded and then buried me in a hug suddenly, his little arms squeezing tightly. Thanks for taking me in, big brother. I know you didn't have to, but I'm glad you did. I hugged him back, honestly glad to have him here. I had never felt anything but love from Arnar and my adopted family, and I'd hoped to be able to share some of that with my little brother. I had wished often over the years that I could bring him here and let him know how it felt to be part of a family. We hadn't known much about family ties after Dad died, and I was glad to have him here with me. I'm glad I did too, kiddo. Now let's eat before dinner gets cold. I showed him the plates I had balanced in my other hand. We ate hastily, but as the sun set, both of us began to migrate to the bedroom. I made a pallet on the floor, offering him my bed as the cat jumped up to take his rightful place. Davin didn't want to take it, told me he could sleep on the floor, but I told him I doubted I'd be sleeping much tonight anyway. Davin took the bed, cuddling down beneath my heavy blankets, and I was unsurprised to hear him snoring a few minutes later. Grendel lay amongst him, taking up a protective position as he stood guard with me. I lay on the floor, playing on my phone as I tried to keep my eyes from shutting. I must have lost out at some point because I woke up to the loudest ruckus of my life. I woke up suddenly to hear a loud crash coming from the kitchen. It sounded like an army of Viking warriors were ransacking my pantry, and Grendel was yowling and butting his head against the door. Davin rolled over, mumbling sleepily before snoring again. The boy could sleep through a bomb, and Grendel must have been loud indeed if he woke him up last night. I edged over to the door as I prepared to peek out, wanting to see what was happening out there, but I hadn't considered the implications until it was too late. The second the door opened more than a crack, Grendel was out and charging for the kitchen. I saw his midnight black coat go loping over the lumpy couch that separated my view from the kitchen, and I hissed at him to come back. I looked back at Davin to make sure he was still asleep, and stepped out into the hallway to try to catch him. Davin, not to mention Sigrun, would be upset if the cat came to harm, and 5-on-1 was quite a lot, even for Grendel. I walked slowly up the hall, listening to the bangs and chuckles from the kitchen as they took what was left. They weren't being particularly gentle as they rooted, but It all came to an end as a loud, angry yowl quieted them. They screamed in a high chipmunky way, and I heard pans rattle and feet slap as they took flight. Grendel chased them out, a hissing, yowling ball of fury, as something cursed and hooted over the sounds of an angry cat. I saw them pass, 5 lumpy somethings that passed into the living room, and Grendel came bounding behind them. I moved to help him, not wanting them to gang up on him, but I wasn't quite fast enough. I came to the end of the hallway when I heard him hissing and swiping, the sounds of running boots as he gave chase, and then it all cut off a moment later. There was a loud yowl and a louder sound of something coming down hard. Then all was silent. I cried out then, calling for Grendel to come back, and that was when they became aware of me. I couldn't see much in that dark soup of the living room, but I could see their eyes as they turned to regard me. I could see 5 sets as they turned in my direction, and they were like animals caught in the flash of a camera. I lost my nerve as they started moving in my direction, and God forgive me, I ran. I got back to my room and closed the door, locking it a second before it began to rattle. I prayed that Grendel was okay, but I also hoped that if he was dead, it was quick. As it rattled, the little creatures hooted and howled on the other side, and I began to wonder if I would be next. Davin woke up as something like a battering ram hit the door. Whatever it was on the other side, it was heavy, and by the hollow booming, I thought it might be the one stealing my pots. They got bored pretty quick, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I could hear the lads raining destruction down on my poor home, and as Davin shuddered against me, I assured him that everything would be okay. He was scared, and he wanted to go out and make sure Grendel was okay, but I kept a hold on him and told him the best we could do was hope for the best. I winced as something broke, the shattering glass muffled by the carpet, and was filled with equal parts impotence and rage. They left before dawn, and I felt safe enough to poke my head out to assess the damage. Davin begged me not to, his eyes swollen and heavy, but I needed to know. I wrapped my hand around the doorknob and stepped out into the chaos. December 17th, Askasleikir. I came out to a maelstrom of mess. As bad as it had been the morning before, it was 10 times as bad now. As I came into the living room, I wasn't sure there was one piece of furniture still upright. The TV had been pushed over, the cord cut, and the screen cracked. The couch was overturned, and my recliner was sliced and pierced. The coffee table was so much kindling now, and they had ground mud and food into the carpet. Someone had taken coal from the coal box and scrawled messages on the wall in a language I couldn't read, and the table was gouged with runes and strange marks. The worst part was that Grendel was nowhere to be found amongst the mess. I moved into the kitchen, hoping maybe I'd find him there. The kitchen was equally as wrecked. Plates and mugs lay in pieces across the linoleum, some of it having been peeled up in ribbons. The Bakelite on the front of the stove had joined it after being shattered, and the smell of spoiled lamb stew lay heavy amongst it. There wasn't a pan or a pot left in the house, the silverware absent to the last teaspoon. What they hadn't eaten or taken, they had thrown around the house, and the whole thing just made me angrier. I had hoped to find Grendel in there, but the longer he was absent, the less likely it seemed that I would find him alive. I looked for him high and low, figuring they had simply killed him when he ran at them. But when I heard him sadly mewing, I honed in on the sound. At least we wouldn't have to bury Davin's cat today, I told myself, as his mews brought me to the laundry room off the kitchen. His meows were coming from the chest freezer, beside the 2-tier washer-dryer, and the small utility room where I kept my meat. The poor thing had been closed inside, and he was shivering pathetically as he tried to push the door open. He jumped into my arms when the freezer came open, and the fearsome little beast butted his head against my chest as he tried to find warmth. It seemed that in these dire times, even Grendel was willing to make friends with his enemies. Davin held his arms out for him when I came into the room, and the big black feline jumped into his arms like a kid at the end of a school day. Davin rubbed his cold fur, trying to get some warmth back into him, and the cat looked at me as if to say, "Thanks, I guess you aren't completely useless." Davin was mooning over him when I left, yawning as I thought longingly about my bed. I wanted to curl up with my brother and the cat and sleep in a big warm pile as the mess sat outside. Instead, I began cleaning up. The longer I cleaned, the madder I got. This was too far. If I hadn't found him earlier, Grendel could have frozen to death. They were attacking in numbers now, Potscraper amongst them. Tonight there would be 6, and if Grendel patrolled tonight, he wouldn't do it alone. I set about making preparations for nightfall, as Davin got up and got ready for the day. He didn't ask about the mess. He knew by now that it was Yule lad related, and set about helping me put the house to rights. Not for the first time, I was glad for his company. I couldn't imagine having to do this alone, and between the two of us, we started setting things in order. When someone knocked on the door a little after 7, he went to answer it as I cleaned jelly off the wall near the fireplace. Ulf blew out a loud whistle as he came in. "Looks like you pissed them off good. You come to gloat, or you come to help us clean?" I asked curtly. "Neither. I came to see if Davin would like to work with me today." Davin perked up, but I glowered at Ulf darkly. "I thought you wanted to keep him out of sight for a few days." Ulf lifted a hand placatingly. "I had to go off farm yesterday, and I couldn't carry him with me as such an errand. I'm here today, though, and I can keep a close eye on him." "Why?" I asked, becoming worried and angry. I was tired, and his words were sounding more and more like a threat. Just a good idea to keep him close," he finished, Davin coming out in his work clothes. "Don't worry, I'll watch him like he was my own," Ulf promised. Davin looked at me pleadingly, and I couldn't say no. Ulf was my best friend, and he and Davin had formed a fast friendship too, it seemed. If Ulf was offering to let him work with him, I couldn't very well take that from him. I nodded, ruffling his hair as he threw a hug around the big Icelander. "Could you feed him?" I asked, suddenly aware that neither of us had eaten. "Someone seems to have stolen all my food, and it wasn't you for a change." Ulf looked wounded, but smiled. "Sure, and I'll make sure the poor lamb doesn't starve. As for yourself," he reached outside the door and dropped off 2 paper bags with food in them. "Mum said to collect the bowls when you finish today. She's certain the lads will have made off with her stew pot from yesterday." I looked ashamed, promising to buy her a new one, but Ulf just brushed it off. "We're family. We look out for each other." They left for the fields, and suddenly I was alone with my mess and my thoughts. I used the time I had to prepare the house. I plugged up, secured, or sealed any opening into the house. I used adhesive to secure the windows, hooking bells to them so I'd know if they were opened. I clogged the drains with towels and washcloths, even stuffing a towel down the mouth of the toilet and putting a heavy block on the lid. I sealed cracks where I found them, using some cement that I had in the shed to seal up even the smallest crack. The chimney presented a bigger problem. If it was big enough for a Father Christmas to creep down, then it would be plenty big enough for a Yule lad. They could close the flue, but that had never stopped Father Christmas to my knowledge. In the end, I stoked the fire and hoped they could still be burned like normal creatures. My brother came home just before dark, a wrapped plate of food in one hand, to find me on the couch sharpening a hatchet. He nervously glanced around the house. "Looks like you've been busy today." I nodded, my eyes still on the chimney. They would have to come in through the front door or the chimney. That was a given. And when they did, I meant to spot them and stop them. I didn't know what I meant to do when I saw them. The rifle shot hadn't even dropped the one lad, but I meant to do something. I was tired of having my home terrorized by these little assholes. Davin held up the plate of food. "Sigrun sent you some dinner. She figured that some of our stuff was probably missing, so she made you a plate to go." An idea occurred. "Set it on the counter," I said, the whetstone still sliding over the axe. "Don't you want to eat it? It's still hot. Just set it down. I'm hoping it'll lure pot liquor out." Davin set the food on the counter and shrugged as he walked to the bedroom. "I think I'm just gonna go read. You seem kinda busy in here." He gave me a weird look, heading into the bedroom to read one of the Hardy Boys novels I had from when I was his age. I was busy, but I hoped not for much longer. As the fire burnt, consuming the fuel I had piled in there, I hunkered beside the couch and waited for them to come. I had done a little research on the potato they had left me. Apparently, it was the only thing they left for naughty children. They were about to see just how bad I could be. Grendel came to sit with me, keeping a wary eye on me as he watched the room. He, too, was the guardian of this place, and he took his sacred trust very seriously. He would never come close enough for me to touch, but I knew that he understood that we were in this together now. I hunkered in the twilight as I waited for them, listening to the house as it creaked and groaned in the light wind outside. I had lived here since I came to stay with them after my father died, and to me, the house was as much a member of the family as Ulf or Arnar. I knew the house, top to bottom, knew how it groaned in the wind, how it seemed to hold its breath in the snow, and how the roof beams seemed to sigh on sunny days. That was a part of my anger as well. They were hurting my house, hurting my friend, and I couldn't let this go on. It was around 1 a.m. when the soot of the chimney started to powder down into the flames. I had only recently added more fuel, creeping back to my spot as my sleepy eyes tried to close. As the ashes rained down, I felt a surge of adrenaline roll over me. They were here, they were coming, but they wouldn't be getting what they expected. They rolled down the chimney, just missing the fire, and landed on my hearthrug. There were 6 now, as I suspected. Sheepcoot, with his wooden leg smoking, Gully Gawk with his frothy beard and little pig eyes, a bandage on his right arm that I was glad to see was paining him. I saw Stubby, who was at least half as tall as the rest and covered in pans, Spoon Licker, thin and haggard, Pot Scraper, wearing a bandolier about his rotund body. Finally, there was a strange 6th member tonight. He was dressed in what could kindly be called armor and jokingly be called an assortment of wooden pots. They had once been used to store food under people's beds, and their lack of iron probably made this ideal for a creature like him. The lid would serve as a helmet, his yellow eyes peeking from beneath it as he held a long hook on the end of a wooden staff. He looked around warily, not as lackadaisical as the others, and seemed to be on guard as he moved for the fridge. They all reminded me of goblins, their skin looking like uncooked dough, and their features pointy and menacing. All of them had knives in their belts, Stubby's blade little more than a sewing needle, and Pot Scraper had an assortment of jars and bottles and a pepper mill on that bandolier around his chest. They all looked like homeless Santas, red coats, red pointy hats, scabby white beards, big, dirty, homemade sweaters poking out from beneath their overalls. But in the firelight, they all looked more like evil elves who had broken free of a toy shop. Even the armored Askasleikir looked like some child's idea of a knight as he held his polearm and slunk around. None of them were taller than 3.5 feet, though, and I was pretty confident that I could bowl them over and send them running. They set straight to their work. Stubby checked for pans. Sheepcoot went to my freezer and grabbed for the frozen sheep cutlets I kept there. Spoon Licker had to settle for licking the spoons on the wallpaper in my kitchen. Gully Gawk set about finding cream in my refrigerator, throwing things on the floor as he hunted. Pot Scraper went straight for the leftovers, as I had known he would, and selected a jar from his belt to season them with. I saw the stalking form of Grendel as he moved in on Spoon Licker, and I prepared for my own charge when he attacked. I clenched my axe and lifted the bat in the other hand, the end studded with nails that I hoped the legends would be right about. Grendel stalked closer, Spoon Licker oblivious to his approach. The other lads were about their tasks and never so much as noticed as I slunk stealthily around the couch. The bristling Tom let out a single yowl as he leapt. The daffy troll turned to look up just as he was buried under a pile of fur and claws. Spoon Licker cried out in a guttural voice like a soccer hooligan, and the other lads were in motion as they looked around to see what was going on. I yelled as I swung the club, running at Pot Scraper as he coolly stared me down and tossed whatever it was in his hand at me. A cloud of powder enveloped me, and I was stopped cold as my eyes stung and my nose ran. I had stepped into a whirlwind of heat, and I shut my eyes as the cloud swirled around me. The first time I was stabbed, I barely felt it, with all the adrenaline kicking around in me. By the 10th time, it was just one more pain amongst many. They stabbed me in the ankles, in the legs, in the calves. Stubby jumped up and drove the needle right into my ass cheek, and I swung the club and axe around like a blind fool. I struck things off the counter. I hit the refrigerator with a metal clong, and the powder around me never seemed to dissipate. I heard Grendel hiss and spit, yowling as he savaged something, and when the stabbing stopped, I was aware of being on my knees. My eyes were on fire, the black powder seeming to proliferate, and I set about in my blind state to stop any of them from getting closer. There was a scuffling sound, Grendel still hissing and spitting as he chased them, and then silence. I coughed, eyes still burning from whatever pot scraper had thrown at me. My breath felt hot and heavy as I sucked it in, and the tears streaming down my face were thick and angry. I put my hands out, feeling my way to the sink, and tried to wash the mess out of my stinging eyes. I could feel the powder coating my face like sand, and as the water hit my skin, the scrim came off like makeup. The heat intensified for a moment, reacting to the water, but as it washed away, I felt relief and managed to open my eyes. I tensed up as something butted against my wounded leg, but it was only Grendel, the sleek black Tom limping a little but otherwise fine. Davin stood in the hallway, peeking at me from the doorway as he took in the scene. It was a real mess in here. The refrigerator had a big cut from my wide swing. The bat was sticking out of the hardwood floor like a ghastly tumor. Dishes had been smashed, and metal bins and holders had been upturned across the counter floor. Flour and powder were everywhere, and as my vision stopped wavering, I knew I'd have a big mess to clean up tomorrow. "Are they gone?" Davin asked, looking scared and curious. I sighed. "Yeah, kid. For now." December 18th. Herdeskittish. Arnar came to see me the next day. Davin had left early that morning, and I'd been asleep on the couch when he knocked. The farmer looked embarrassed, and I figured that Ulf had something to do with him showing up. He took one look at my stiff gait and blotchy face, and shook his head. He must have known they would come for me, and I couldn't help but feel that his insight might have helped me get the better of them. "I'm sorry for the way I spoke to you, lad. We had no sheep go missing last night. No damage to the cows either, but it looks as though you may have been the reason why." "Yes, sir. They were too busy breaking into my house and stabbing me in the ass to worry about livestock, I suppose." I told him what happened, and he tried not to laugh when I told him how Pottersfell had nearly blinded me. "You had to know that old goblin, Gilgigor, would want revenge for what you did to him. How are you for food? I'll bring you some pots and pans if you need them." "I'll be fine. I can make it through this," I said, not really sure if I could or not. He smiled at me and smacked me sturdily on the shoulder. "You may not be of the land, boy, but you have grit for certain. If we can help you in any way, let us know." I perked up a little bit. I could use some hands tonight. "It's 2 against 6 and 7 tonight," he said, looking sheepishly away. "I can't promise any of the men will come to your aid. They're superstitious. This is an old place, and up until now we've lived in peace with the fairies and the old things. There's talk that you and your brother are the reason that they're angry this year," he confided, spitting it out like a sour taste. "Us? How? I've been here longer than any of the other hands. I've never even seen one of these lads until this year. I know, but they hear your brother talking about Father Christmas, and, lad, that's not of our land. They think that his talk has angered the Yule lads, and they're taking it out on us." I looked at him steadily. "I hope that you and Ulf don't think that way." "Never think it, boy. To me, you and Ulf are my sons, and Davin is quickly taking a similar place in my heart. I love you, boy, and I don't want to see you hurt." "So," I said, building up my resolve to ask the question, "will you and Ulf stand with me tonight?" He breathed in a long breath, and I could see the mustache rustle under the assault of his nasal inhale. "I'm sorry, boy. I love you, but I can't stand against Fae. Maybe if you apologize to the lads and made a sacrifice of some kind, they might be placated and leave you alone." I shook my head, finding myself more hurt by his refusal to help than I had thought I would. "I won't placate them. They attacked my house. I can't stand for that." "Be reasonable, boy. You can't fight the Fae and win. They're older and craftier and stronger than we mortals are. I'm tired, Arnar. If you need me, I'll be here, defending my home. I'm Probably going to take a bit of leave until the situation is resolved." He sighed, but he nodded. "Good luck, boy." With that, he left us to our fate. Davin came back around lunchtime. He flopped onto the couch and looked upset as Grendel hopped up onto his chest. He stroked the cat and watched me clean up the little bits of grime left behind. I noticed how quiet he was after a few minutes and asked what was wrong. I wasn't sure at first that I was going to get an answer. One of the farm hands said he wouldn't work with me. We were supposed to be herding sheep, but he told Ulf that he didn't want to be around me since we had offended Faye. I felt anger creep into my guts. "Who was it?" I asked through clenched teeth. "Ulf told me not to tell you. He said it's not their fault. They're all afraid of what could happen to their homes and their families. Ulf said that we should make an offering to the lads, maybe try to make amends." I lifted the leg of my jeans and showed him the wound from last night's assault. "You think I should reward them for this? I'm not giving in to a bunch of little ankle biters who want to attack our house. Tonight, I'll show them what they're up against, and we'll see who makes a fool out of who." I realize now that was the lack of sleep talking, but at the time I was filled with rage that these things were coming into my house. At first, they had just been cute little legends about holiday pranksters, but now they had become some sort of ever-present boogeyman that waited until nightfall to strike. I wouldn't have it. I wasn't going to get sliced up in my own home and just let it lie. I'd be ready tonight. I wouldn't be the only one bleeding this time. Little did I know that tonight would be a change of tactics for them. When the sun went down, I set about preparing my home for war. The windows were secured with caulk. The doors were locked, bolted, and weather-sealed along the base. The chimney was plugged with an assortment of blankets and barbed wire from the shed. I lit no fire that night, and as I hunkered in the living room, I shivered against the cold. The wind was howling outside, and I found myself nodding as the hours passed in silence. Davin and Grendel were in the bedroom, snug in their bed, and hopefully safe from all this. I'd given Grendel the night off after his hard work last night. He was sitting on my brother's chest when I left the room, licking his wounded leg and watching me go with a sense of determination. If any of them made it into the room, they'd have a fight on their hands. I shook my head to clear the sleep. They'd be here soon. They had to be. What kind of game were they playing? They were never consistent in their arrival, and I suddenly wondered if they were still going about their usual holiday duties. Was I just a box on their checklist? Were they still leaving presents and causing a little mischief in other houses? The more I thought about it, the more heavy my eyes became, and before I knew it, I was snoring against the arm of the couch. I was roused from sleep around midnight by the last sound I expected to hear in my house. The front door creaked open before slamming shut hard enough to rattle the windows. I bounded up from beside the couch, my hurt legs stiff and asleep after having knelt for so long. I ran to the door, expecting to see all 7 lads waiting for me on the mat. But there was nothing. I checked the door and found that it was still locked. I looked at it sleepily, trying to decide if I had imagined it or something. That's when the cabinet started slamming. It started with the pot cabinet. It was empty, of course. The lads had stolen all my cookware, and the door crashed open and shut in a quick 3-lick pattern. Then it moved up to the pantry, the door creaking open as the thick wood slammed shut with enough force to rattle the hinges. I had run into the kitchen, weapons at the ready, but there was nothing there. The doors opened and closed, and all the while, there were no hands to move them. Then the cupboard under the sink joined the chorus. The dented refrigerator door swung drunkenly open, the light blinking before the door slammed shut again. Even the sliding door on my bread box was opening and slamming shut, the glass shattering as it connected with the frame, though that still didn't stop the tracks from running back again. It was like something out of a poltergeist movie, all the doors slamming shut on their own accord, their rhythm hellish in its volume. When the hallway door slammed as well, I jumped and spun, ready to attack, but found nothing but air. They were all doing it before long, a thunderous cacophony of slamming doors and creaking joints. I put my hands over my ears and tried to block it out, but it was impossible. Finally, I went and sat in the bedroom, Davin sitting up in bed and holding a squirming Grendel. I shrugged at him tiredly. Guess we have to put up with this until daybreak. How wrong I was. December 19th, Skirgomer. The doors didn't stop slamming that day. Well, that's not exactly true. As I lay in my bed, my own door braced with a chair, I would feel my tired eyes try to slip shut. My brain would beg for sleep. My body would try to oblige, but the second my soft snores would begin, the door to my room would slam shut and I would wake up. I repeated this process throughout the day, nearly sleeping only to be jerked violently awake again. Coupled with my lack of sleep from the last few days, it started to take a toll. It didn't seem to matter what I did to the door either. I tried locking the door, but it seemed the mechanism held no power here. I would bounce awake, trying to throw it open to see who was on the other side, only to find it locked again. I tried tying a bedsheet around it, securing the other end to my desk, but the door would always slam, and I always found the sheet untied. I tried the chair, tried tying the sheet to the chair. Hell, I even tried throwing the mattress off the bed over the door, deciding to sleep in a beanbag on the floor. No matter what I tried, the door still slammed, and I still woke up. The only other time it stopped was when Ulf came to call around mid-morning. I was getting tea in the kitchen, hoping that a cup of chamomile would put me to sleep, when I heard a soft knock on the front door. I nearly dropped the teapot as I charged towards it, Grendel running scared as he tried to get out of my way. I didn't know what prank this was, but I was mad enough to throw caution to the wind and play into this trap. I was mad, I was hurt, and I was exhausted. If they were going to play childish pranks now, then I was going to punt this little asshole down the road until his head smashed on the sidewalk. Ulf backed away a step when I threw the door open, my face likely looking crazed. "Geez, Da said you were looking rough, but I didn't know what to expect. Did you get any sleep last night?" I threw the door open and indicated the rest of the house. "Who can sleep? These little bastards won't stop slamming doors. All the doors. All night." Ulf popped his head in and looked around, clearly concerned. "I don't hear anything," he finally said, after listening for a few minutes, and I snarled at little creatures who were likely laughing at me as we spoke. "You seem tired, Frady. Maybe it's time to make peace with the wee folk. I know they beat you up pretty bad the other night, but it's best not to be on the wrong side of Faye. Just make your offering and put this all—" "Have you come to help me or not?" I asked curtly, not wanting to hear this after the night I'd had. "I'm trying to, but you're making it very difficult. I don't know how the Fae work in your land, but out here they tend to be a little less understanding of slights. Unless you're prepared to hunker down with me and help me fight them off, I don't think I need any help." Ulf blew out a breath and shook his head. "I'll let you rest. Maybe tomorrow you'll be in a better mood." With that, he left. The second I closed the door, I heard one slam shut somewhere in the house. It went on like that all day. The doors slammed repeatedly, but never in the place where I was. As I came stumbling awake, whether I was in my bed or on the couch or on my feet like some cow in the field, silence would stretch just long enough for me to doze off again. Then it would start, and I would be brought awake again. Davin had gotten more sleep than me, but I could tell that he too was starting to feel it. Grendel seemed in a constant state of ears laid back, and we were all tired of being cooped up in the bedroom. I'd brought them food, not wanting either of them to go out into the house, and I'd guarded the bathroom door when David needed to use it. I'd become very paranoid about Davin's safety, especially after the comment by the other hands. As he emptied his bladder, Davin made one more attempt at sanity. "Why don't you just apologize to the lads?" I'd been dozing when I shook awake and asked what he'd said. I said, "Why don't you just apologize to the lads? They're wrong, but we don't seem to be able to beat them. Why not just admit we did something that we shouldn't have and make this stop? I sighed. Not him, too. I can't just apologize to them. They're wrecking my house. They hurt Grendel. They hurt you. I can't just say sorry and pretend that none of this ever happened. Davin flushed the commode and walked out, looking at me with a tired scowl. I don't know, it just seems like this is a lot. How much longer do we have to do this? 5 more nights, I said, my brain having focused on that fact for a few days now. After Christmas, we'll be shed of them. And if this happens next year? He asked. I paled. I hadn't thought of that. What if this was just the new normal? What if every year for 2 weeks I had to fight or run from these vengeful lads? No, I told myself. No, it couldn't be. Things would be different next year. This couldn't go on. It just couldn't. I'm gonna go get some sleep, Davin said, realizing the silence had gone on a little too long. You should get some sleep too. You look like you're going crazy. Instead of sleeping, I just lay in bed and let the thoughts roll through my head like a horde of beetles with dung. The door still slammed periodically. The cabinets joined in every now and again. And as my eyes got heavy, my mind kept wandering over the events of the past few days. The lads were the easiest ones to blame for this, but was it possible that they were just a scapegoat? I'd been thinking over what Davin had said, about how the farmhand said that he wasn't of the land, and I wondered if the Yule lads were just a means to an end. What if this was all some elaborate trick to be rid of the foreigners? Maybe it had never occurred to them that I wasn't of the land either until now. My voice had a hint of an English accent, but most of them spoke English, so it never bothered them. Had the arrival of my younger brother made them realize I wasn't a native to the area? Why should that matter anyway? Most of them could trace their roots back to other places. No, this had to be something else. As I lay in bed, however, it became harder and harder to think clearly. The longer I thought about it, the more I realized that I had to be sure. I think that might have been the first time I contemplated a new plan. A plan that would prove even more devastating than the last. The next thing I knew, the sun was setting, and I was aware that I'd been laying in silence for most of the afternoon. This made me apprehensive. Davin was asleep, the feisty Tom curled up on his chest as he too breathed lightly. But I wasn't about to get tricked. What was going to happen now? Were they going to ambush us? Would my door suddenly pop open and all 8 tonight, Yule lads come screaming in to finish the job? Why would Scrimgamor's brothers come to my house anyway? I had no Skyr for him. I had seen the last of it stolen days ago. Why would any of them bother to come back, for that matter? I still remembered the legend. I was still operating under the assumption that they were playing by the rules. My eyes had just started to get heavy when something new woke me up. My eyes popped open like a cartoon character, and I made a disgusted sound as I wrapped my fingers around my nose. The smell was undescribable. It smelled like curdled milk, like spoiled cheese, like unwashed flesh that's been soaking in curds. I heard heavy footsteps in the hall, followed by a trumpetous breaking of wind as the owner rambled through my house. The flatulence was followed by another, the owner groaning as a new smell joined the throng. It smelled like an overripe outhouse, that sickeningly sweet smell of lactose gas. I tried to get up, reaching for the nail bat as I came, but the smell made my head swim, and I sat down hard on the bed again. I covered my mouth with my free hand, the vomit hot and ready as it tried to make its way up my throat. Davin came awake suddenly, gagging wetly as he covered his face with his hands. The viscous substance slipped through his fingers, pattering onto the bedspread as his body jerked and bucked. He threw up all down his front, his heaving becoming dry as he pushed everything out of himself, and he covered his nose with his hand as he tried to block out the smell. Grendel's reaction was even worse. The cat was writhing on the coverlet, trying to cover its nose with its paws. Grendel threw up too, a noxious mess sputtering from his nose and mouth, and he stumbled off the bed as he fell to the floor. He wobbled, looking like he might be drunk. "What is that smell?" Davin asked pitifully, doubling over as he dry heaved. I don't know," I bellowed, staggering up and reaching for the door. I felt like I might throw up too, and the food I'd eaten for dinner churned in my stomach like an angry sea. I'd smelled all kinds of animal waste, been around dead things, and even had to empty and clean out an old latrine once, so that the toilets had somewhere to drain. But nothing was like this reek. I twisted the handle, but the door wouldn't open. I wrenched on the handle, but the door was held by something. Was this Erutious? Some kind of reverse of his power? I don't know, and I didn't care. I just wanted to be free of that smell. There were no windows in my room, all the windows being mostly in the front of the house, and the door remained our only point of egress. I kept pulling, retching, listening to Davin heave as he staggered out of bed. I heard Grendel hiss and leap away, his own piteous mews coming as he dug his head under the bed. We ended up making masks out of cloth, but it did little to blunt the smell. When dawn broke, the door finally creaked open noisily. The smell lingered on, though, filling the house with a nauseating aroma of rotten eggs and bad cheese. It seemed the Yule lads had decided that chemical warfare was next on the agenda. It was, in that very moment, my face covered with a bandana, as I began unsecuring every hole in my home, that the plan came back to me. If the Yule lads had decided to take it up a notch, then so could I. Tonight, we'd see who got who. Tonight, we'd see just how far these lads were willing to take it. December 20th, Bukranagir. It was a miserable night. Davin, the poor kid, spent the early morning lying on the floor and heaving noisily. I understood completely, but we really couldn't leave. We could hear the lads out there tearing the house up again, and leaving would put us right in their hands. The room reeked of vomit, but somehow it still wasn't as bad as the smell that came from under the door. It was something indescribable. Rotten cheese and spoiled milk, garbage left out in the sun, an old animal carcass in the first few days of rot, other fouler things I didn't have a name for. It was terrible, and when they left, we came stumbling from the room like drunkards. I drank in the slightly less stagnant air like a drowning man, and when Grendel came flying out of the bedroom, he ran straight out the front door and didn't come back till nightfall. The cat wobbled badly, almost running into the couch as he went, and as he doubled, I kind of thought I might be more than nauseous. Ulf and I had drank quite a few times, Icelandic spirits being very different from the English drink, and when I fell, I grabbed the hallway carpet to stop from falling off the earth as it spun. I felt like I'd spent a night out with the farmhands. When the nausea passed, or at least lessened, I left Davin in the bathroom, the poor kid still dry heaving into the basin. It was time to get to work. I knew what I needed, but I wasn't sure if I could find it. I went to the shed and started pushing things aside as I hunted. I found a big wicker basket that Sigrun used to carry food in sometimes, and freed it from the muck it was sitting in. It was sturdy, the inside ringed with metal hoops like a barrel, and I felt sure that the oil or whatever it was sitting in wouldn't hurt it. After a little more searching, I found a battered old kettle too. It fit into the basket easily enough, and as I moved it, I found something interesting beneath it. I grinned as I pushed it with my foot, seeing the rust, but knowing it would still work. I tossed it into the basket and headed for the door, needing to get started. My foot hit a bike lock as I left, nearly tripping me, and I added it to the basket as well. It might help me secure the surprise inside. I went back inside and fished out some sausages from the freezer. I'd have to hurry to get ready for tonight, the day sprinting by like it was on skates. Bugnikreikir would be coming, and for this to work, I would have to be quick, and a little bit lucky. I started cooking sausages right away. I had set the basket up before coming in, figuring the lads wouldn't see me all the time. Well, hoping they couldn't anyway. If they could, then nothing I did would matter. But if they could, then surely I wouldn't be able to shoot one. As the sausages finished cooking, I placed them carefully into the basket. I arranged them in a haphazard pile so they hid my surprise at the bottom, and carried them carefully into the living room. One false move, and the surprise would be over, so I had to be as careful as possible. Bjuknakragir might fall for it once, but if I tipped my hand, he'd never fall for it again. I set the sausages around the surprise, making each movement carefully so as to look natural. I had to be slow. I didn't want to set it off and ruin the bait, but I also needed to hurry. The days were short now, and the height of the winter was coming. It would be dark before I knew it. Soon I had the basket sitting on the counter, the wicker heating up as the enticing smell of meat did battle with the foul residuals of the night before. I heard Grendel leap up onto the counter and sniff at it. I hissed at him, not wanting him to bother it, but that's when I heard the creak from the rafters. Was it that late already? I looked out the window and saw that the sun was sinking low. There wasn't much time. I laid one of the sausages on the counter, enticing Grendel to stay, but he didn't need much in the way of incentive. He had heard the creaks from the rafters and was content to lay next to the warm basket and eat his dinner. His eyes never left the ceiling, though, and I could track the lad's progress as my living room was filled with the delicious smell of cooked meat. Davin came out of the bathroom, looking pale and wobbling with each step. When I offered him one of the smoked sausages, he turned green and stumbled towards the back of the house. The smell of bad cheese still lingered, but it was now just a ghost of the scent it had been before. It was still a pungent reminder of what would return tonight, and I couldn't suffer another night like that. I doubted that any offering I could muster up would appease the lads. It had been a long time since some human had dared to attack them, longer since one had tried to defend his home from them, and it was likely an insult that I wouldn't gift my way out of. But maybe there was another way. I yawned theatrically as I pretended not to hear the roof groaning. I was exhausted, but I knew that sleep was unlikely to come tonight. Maybe not for the next few nights. If this went as planned, I might be up for the foreseeable future. Though I was hoping I might finally get a good night's sleep at some point. Either way, something was going to have to give. I picked up Grendel and started walking towards the bedroom, yawning again for good measure. He wiggled a bit, clearly not wanting to leave, but when I looked at him, he seemed to understand what we were doing. I hadn't smelled cheese or heard a door slam since last night, and I suspected that the lads thought they were going to get a good meal out of me before they started up their shenanigans again. Then what, I wondered? Would they begin anew with a full belly? Would they leave me alone and go back to the Fae satisfied? I doubted it, but we'd see. I got my supplies ready and went back to the door, preparing for the battle to come. I cracked it a little, the newly oiled hinges moving silently as I waited to hear the sound I'd been listening for. The ceiling creaked as Sausage Snatcher scoped out the scene, and as he shimmied down to inspect the basket, I saw the back of the fat little goblin who barely fit in his red coat. His clothes were shabby, long grease stains from the fingers he'd wiped down, making rivers of grease that circulated the garment. The pants looked ready to split, and he wore no shirt beneath his coat. His chubby arms poked out like the sausages he loved so much. He landed with a loud bump on the countertop and put a tentative hand onto the basket. He pulled out a single glistening sausage and stuffed it piggishly into his mouth. He was apprehensive, not expecting to find his favorite treat in the house of an aggressor, but whatever served him for a brain was clearly not accustomed to asking a lot of questions. When the first sausage went down okay, he grabbed another and threw it into his greasy mouth. He chewed loudly, the food falling on the countertop. I could see his teeth as they glistened in the semi-darkness, another sausage disappearing into his grubby maw as he chewed noisily. The folds on the back of his neck jiggled wetly as he ate, the sound of his chewing almost as nauseating as his brother's smell. I crept from the room, bat in one hand and axe in the other, using the smacking and snarfing as a cover for my own footsteps. Grendel crept along at my side, glancing up every few feet to make sure I hadn't lost my nerve. We likely looked ridiculous, a pair of children playing pretend, but the large lad eating my sausages was not to be taken lightly. I glanced around, figuring that Door Slammer or Cure Gobbler were probably close by too. Maybe they hadn't seen us yet. Maybe they had. Nevertheless, I slunk quietly to the edge of the hall and waited to see if my trap would work. The little porker was gobbling the sausages, hands stuffing them into his pockets almost as fast as they were shoveling them into his mouth. He hadn't even looked up from the basket since he'd begun eating, and this whole purpose seemed to be making the sausages disappear into one hole or another. He'd been getting close to the bottom of the basket now, his pudgy hands scraping the bottom as he kept gobbling the sausages. I had cooked a lot of them, 5 or 6 pounds, and I wanted him to be nice and comfortable when he finally found what was at the bottom of that basket. I was about 5 feet away when I heard the trap snap, and Buchna Krieger started to scream. As he started yelling, sending sausage bits flying, I couldn't help but grin maniacally. Damn, but it felt good to hurt one of those things. His arms and shoulder were stuck in the bear trap, the iron clearly hurting him, and the basket tipped and bounced as he tried to push himself free. As I ran up to grab the basket, and the lad, he turned his head to look at me, and I saw fear in those piggy eyes. Door Slammer sprang out then, popping from beneath the sink, and Skewer Gobbler came out of the pantry, propelled by a loud belch and the rotten smell of curdled cheese. He yelled at me, and I became aware that the smell was coming from his mouth. When he opened his gob, the 5 teeth that were left looked sad and embarrassed to be there, the scent flooding out like a wave of noxious gas. I wasted no time, though. I lifted the bat and pointed to Sausage Swiper. "Stop, or I'll kill him right here. These nails are iron and he's already hurt. Take one more step and I'll end him right now." Both lads looked unsure, not entirely certain what to do with this unexpected event. They looked at each other, seeming to have a silent conversation amongst themselves. I had heard that sometimes close siblings can do such a thing, and given their supernatural nature, I wondered if they might have some sort of telepathy. I'd expected they might try to bargain. Maybe they would even call the other lads to attack me all at once. But instead, the two just vanished in a haze, and the smell of Skewer Gobbler evaporated too. I glanced around, expecting an attack, but it never came. Suddenly, the house was empty except for the screaming of Sausage Swiper. He was feverish, trying to shake himself free as he looked around, clearly expecting his brothers to come back. He'd been abandoned, his blood staining the sausages a deep red. I could see it as it pooled on the counter beneath the wicker basket, and the sight filled me with hope. I'd done it. I'd caught one. My joy was short-lived, though, and quickly turned to confusion and dread. Much like a dog who's caught his tail, I didn't know what to do with him now that I had him. I'd expected his brothers to want to make a deal with me, not just to leave him like this. As the silence permeated the house, I just shrugged and picked up the basket, taking it to my room for safekeeping. I guess there would be no sleep for me that night after all. That night, I watched the little monster until the break of day. December 21st. Glucageier. I wish my shot had missed. I wish I'd never seen one of the lads in the flesh. I wish I'd made my offering. I wish I'd just left Iceland forever with my brother. I wish I'd never fought these Yuletide horrors at all. Above all, I wish I'd never taken Sausage Swiper hostage. At the time, however, I was ecstatic. I sat in my room with the basket, grinning like Captain Silver as he stood over his treasure. He had stopped screaming after the first hour, and now he just hunkered in his trap and grumbled. The grumbling and infrequent yells were the only proof that he was still alive, and that was good. I wanted him breathing for the second part of my plan, the part where I gave the lads their gift. The 21st would mark something of a lull in the conflict. I should have taken advantage of it and got some sleep. Instead, I watched the fat little Fay as he growled and wiggled and tried to get free of the bear trap. I say bear trap, but it was really more of a fox trap. There were no bears in Iceland, and it was something we used to catch the little beasts when they came to steal food or became a nuisance. Their pelts were pretty warm and very beautiful, but we tried not to kill them unless we really had to. It was almost too small for the little porker. He was trapped at the shoulder, the bike lock I had used to secure him to the metal frame on the basket, the only thing keeping him there as he lay on the bottom. He had figured out pretty quickly that he couldn't open the trap with his bare hands. Something about the iron the trap was made of sapped his strength, and he had only really struggled for the first hour or so. Now he lay there, piggy little eyes glaring at me, as he tried to find some way to get loose from his new prison. Whatever the iron did to him also stopped him from using magic, so that was an added bonus. At least I wouldn't have to worry about waking up with a mouthful of dung or my teeth made of beetles or something. Davin stretched as he woke up, but he drew back in surprise when he noticed the lad in the basket sitting at the foot of the bed. He had managed to sleep through all of it. The kid really could snore through a bomb, and now he was wide awake and terrified. He cried out as the lumpy thing hooted at him, though whether it was a plea for help or an insult, I didn't know. What is that?" he said, making the lad wince from the loudness of his voice. "This is Sausage Swiper," I said, as though it were obvious. "Okay, well, why is he in our bedroom?" "I captured him." "You did what?" Davin asked, seeming scared and unsure at the revelation. "I captured him, and now I will trade him for a cessation of hostilities. They can't have 13 lads if one of them is stuck here with me, can they? They'll want a bargain, and if they don't give me what I want, then they won't have what they want." "But what's to stop them from just coming in and taking him?" Davin asked, his face scrunched up. I looked unsure as I tried to think of an answer for that one. Somehow this was something that had only now occurred to me. Of course they'd just come in and take him. Why would they bargain with me? There would be 9 of them tonight. More than enough to take 2 humans and a cat. Even if I stood them off here, how long could I hope to hold them out? Hell, one of them could just open the door. Unless I got prepared real quick. "Davin, watch him," I growled and grabbed my coat. "Me?" he asked skeptically. "Yes, I just need a few things from the barn. I'll be back in less than an hour. Don't let him out of the trap for any reason. Do you understand?" Davin nodded, though he didn't seem to like it. He threw a hug around my middle as I went to leave, and I could feel wetness on the front of my shirt. He was scared, of that I was certain, but I hadn't stopped to think how strange this must be for him. He was used to living in the city, where the most dangerous thing was the pedophile on the floor below you, or the stray dog who was hungry and looking for food. These things, these lads, couldn't be picked up by the police or trapped by the dog catcher. These creatures were supernatural, and whether I had meant to or not, I had brought him into all this. I wrapped my arms around him, trying to remember that I had started out with the intention of making this the most memorable Christmas in Iceland. I guess I had succeeded there, for better or worse. "Don't worry, kid. This'll all be over soon. Next year we'll laugh about it." I pray now that I'm right. When I poked my head in an hour later, Davin was still sitting on my bed, staring at the little creature in the basket. Sausage Swiper was staring right back, trying to commit his face to memory, it seemed, and Grendel was sitting on Davin's lap, his eyes intent on the little guy in the trap. I looked at Davin and gave him a thumbs up. He returned it, and I closed the door behind myself. With the prisoner under watch, it was time to set my plan in motion. I set up an array that would have put Kevin McAllister himself to shame. I had swiped more traps from the shed, whole boxes of 10-penny nails, wooden boards of carpet tacks that we had saved for some reason, barbed wire, several horseshoes that I thought I might be able to rig up to fall on the would-be intruders. I set most of them up in the hall and the kitchen, around the fireplace too, in case they had come in that way. I strung the barbed wire up in the hallway, crisscrossing it so I could step over it, but the lads would have a time getting around it. I finally just set some of the horseshoes up on the door, hoping they would fall on them, but I kept a few back for later. In a pinch I could throw them, I guessed. I put hay over the top of all of it, sprinkling nails and the nail strips amongst it so they would step on them and not realize it. All the while I felt like someone was watching me as I worked. I kept glancing around, trying to see if Ulf or one of the other farmhands had come to find me spreading hay in my house, but no one was ever around. It was a hard feeling to describe, like bugs crawling on me, but no matter how many times I looked, there was never anyone there. It made me work faster as I tried to get it all done so I could leave the front room for the quiet solace of the back of the house. As the afternoon crept in like a thief, I grabbed what little food we had left and brought it to the bedroom so we could have something to eat while we held out. "Who comes tonight?" Davin asked, munching on a granola bar as he leaned against the bed. "Glukagayr, the window peeker. They say he watches people through their windows, trying to find things that he'd like to steal. At least, we don't have to worry about that. There are no windows for him to look through back here." Davin nodded, but seemed unsure. I finished up my meager dinner and sat to watch Sausage Snatcher. He was asleep, I thought, or just pretending, and it didn't take long before Davin was snoring too. I tried my best to resist the urge to sleep, but after so little sleep lately, my eyes were soon slipping shut. What if Sausage Snatcher was just pretending? What if he got away and joined the other lads? What if I was snoring a minute later, head pillowed against my arm, and I almost slept through their arrival. I snapped awake when I heard the front door bang open and was on my feet in a heartbeat. My watch said it was 10 o'clock, and I looked at Sausage Snatcher to find him awake and grinning at me. He garbled something in his flimmy language, but I didn't understand him. He started shouting, raising a yell from his prison, and I heard the sounds of boots moving towards us. I pushed the basket lid back down, muffling him somewhat, but they had to know where he was. I listened, expecting to hear the sounds of anguish, of surprise, but the lads navigated my traps easily. They were in the hallway in short order, and that was the first time I heard one of them come down on a nail or find a trap in the hay. That's when it hit me. How could I have been so stupid? Window Peeker had probably been watching me all afternoon. He couldn't see me putting traps in the back of the house. No windows back there, so the traps in the hallway were a complete surprise. They squealed and yelped as they found the nails, the fox traps, the tack boards, and I was glad that something had slowed them down. I woke Davin, handing him a crowbar and telling him to be ready when the door opened. Davin gripped the crowbar, looking nervous but ready. Grendel too seemed ready for anything, hunkered low as he prepared to pounce on the first thing through the door. We stood for a count of 30, before the door sprang open, the nails I had used to hold it shut flying back like shrapnel. Potoskville was first, the armored juggernaut running in with his wooden armor clanking. Giljagor was behind him, and I launched a horseshoe at the bulbous head as he came screaming into the room. It struck him right between the eyes, and I roared out my laughter as the armored lad caught my axe on his hooked pole. It was hard to tell who was after that. I saw Grendel jump on one of them, slashing and tearing as he rode him to the ground. I saw Davin swinging his crowbar as the little shadow moved in on him. But he drove them back, and when I planted a foot on Pottersville and rolled him back into the hall, I saw many of them retreating after him. We chased them out into the hall, the traps slowing them as they ran for the door. The two of us came whooping and hollering into the living room, the 9 of them in full flight. They were leaking tar and squealing in surprise, their attacks thwarted as they ran into the night. We gave chase. We stood in the doorway and watched them run, both of us winded, but knowing that we had done well. Our victory, however, came at a cost. As the two of us returned, grinning and talking about tomorrow night's battle, we noticed the black shape lying on the floor of the bedroom. Grendel was breathing quickly, but his flank was bloody, his left leg curled and dribbling on the floor. Davin went to him, crying but unsure how to comfort him. He'd been stabbed and kicked, and he looked up at me with eyes that begged for help. Davin broke down, his tears spilling down his face, but I wasn't about to let them take Grendel from us. The lads had taken too much already. "Wrap him in a blanket," I said, scooping up the basket as I turned for the door. "Sigrun will know what to do with him." December 22nd. Gottapuffer. Olaf came out onto the porch to talk with me. I was sitting with the basket on my lap, staring at the snow. He took one look at the basket and shook his head. "I see you opted to provide an offering." "Not so much," I mumbled. Ulf opened the basket, but recoiled when he looked inside. Sausage Swiper leered up at him, his look predatory, maybe a little pleading as well. As Ulf set the lid back on the basket, the lad groaned pitifully. Ulf looked at me in disbelief, clearly impressed, but clearly understanding the gravity of what I'd done better than I did. "Do you know what you've done?" he said, as if he couldn't even believe it. "Yeah, I chose to stand and fight as a man does when his back is against the wall." Ulf rolled his eyes. "I swear, Frady, the longer you live here, the more you sound like a Viking." "I wish I could say the same," I said darkly. Ulf threw his hands up. "What can I tell you, Frady? I'm sorry. If you want, I'll stand with you tonight, so that my mother's cat can take the rest of the night off." "How is Grendel?" I asked, afraid of how he would answer. "He's hurt pretty bad. Mother says that he needs rest. She's offered to let him stay until he feels better, but he won't be parted from your brother. I believe your brother is the first person I've seen him take to." "Can he stay here too?" I asked suddenly. "Only for a few nights. If their beef is with me, I'd rather keep him out of it." "Of course, but why don't you stay too?" I looked down, wanting to accept, but knowing I couldn't afford to be weak right now. "Your Da's been like a second father to me. I won't bring Faye down on his household." Ulf nodded. "If you're sure." "I am. I couldn't very well bring the lad with me, not into Arnar's house." That was why I was on the porch in the first place. I'd let Davin carry the cat, his yowls weak and pitiful, and I'd taken the basket with my prize inside. Sausage Snatcher had kicked and bit, shaking the basket with every thrash, but we had run like hell itself was after us to the longhouse. I could feel their eyes on me as we took to the night, window peeper probably keeping a tab on us, but they didn't try anything, and we finally made it to the longhouse. I had stayed on the porch as Sigrun worked on the brave cat. I didn't dare let the basket out of my sight, and I'd kept a foot pressed on it the whole time. He groaned and rolled, seeming to plead with me to just open the basket and turn him loose, but I cared little for his whining. Who cared if this little bastard was uncomfortable? He and his ilk had made my night a living hell, and they had almost killed Grendel. I was in no mood to show him any hospitality, no more than I already had. Ulf sat next to me, though he seemed a little uncomfortable at how close he was to the little beastie. "Were you serious about what you said? Would you stand with me tonight if it came down to it?" Ulf snorted and smacked me on the shoulder. "I will. If my brother is set against Faye, then I suppose I am as well." I smiled and threw a one-armed hug around him. "You're a good friend, Ulf." He went back inside for a little, and I heard him and his father talking loudly. I felt selfish as I heard them get louder and louder. Ulf was risking his place in the house for me. His father wouldn't cross the Fae, wouldn't dare to set himself against them. But Ulf was young and brash. He knew better, I was sure of it, but he would stand with me regardless. He came out with a duffel bag over one shoulder, and a resolute look spread across his face. "Let's go, before I lose my nerve," he half-whispered. As we left, I heard the door push open, and Davin stepped frantically onto the porch. "Where are you going? Were you just going to leave me behind?" I could see Arnar in the doorway, his face disapproving, but he seemed to have come to terms with my decision to fight. "Stay here," I told him, getting down on his level as I explained the situation to him. "Stay with Grendel, and keep him safe. He needs you to protect him now. I'll be back when this is all over. Count on it." "But—" he started to turn and look at Arnar, clearly wanting to go, but not wanting to leave Grendel behind. "Ulf's coming with me," I said. "He's going to help me defend the house. You rest. Keep Grendel safe. I'll come back when everything's done." He liked the idea of Ulf coming with me, and that seemed to be enough to turn him around and send him back to the injured cat. I locked eyes with Arnar, someone who seemed to know exactly what was in that basket under my arm, and he nodded before telling me to take care of his son. "I will," I answered, and the two of us set off. Ulf raised an eyebrow when he saw the house, taking in the hay and the nails and the various other things scattered across the dwelling. "Hard wood not to your liking? Careful where you step. I got traps under there." He nodded and picked his way through the house carefully. He'd brought an old axe, something I'd seen hanging over the mantel, and he smiled when I asked him about it. I knew the tales about the axe, of course, something his ancestors had passed down through the centuries, and the runes on it led me to believe his da when he said that it had once ridden in a longboat from Norway. Indiana Jones would have said it belonged in a museum for sure, but I let him tell it, just like he had when we were kids, as we waited for the lads to show up. He gave it a lick across the whetstone as he told the story, and the sound of that rasping blade almost put me to sleep. "When the land was being settled, my several times great-grandfather, another Ulf, came with his father and a small clan of men from Norway. That was a taking time for my people. We raided and burned, but eventually we settled with a lord who kept us fed and set us on his enemies. The axe has been handed down through the line, and there are even stories that Ulf's son Gorl fought creatures of Fey with it. When we finally settled here, the farm that's been in my family for so long, they hung up the axe for good. I'm the first man to take it up in battle in probably 10 generations. We only usually take it down to do upkeep or replace the handle." "Let's hope part of that upkeep is sharpening the blade," I said, jokingly, but I had gazed at the ancient thing too many times to not know that it was very sharp. "So," he said, as he put the axe away, "do you want to tell me why in Frigg's name you thought it was a good idea to trap one of those lads?" I sighed. I had thought I could use him as a bargaining chip, but when they came in last night, I didn't even try. "I'm tired, Ulf. I don't think they want to bargain. I feel like I need to sleep for about a week straight, if this ever ends. Frady, you need to cut him loose." "No," I said quickly, watching the basket fidget and shake. "If it comes down to it, I might need him. Besides, that's one less lad that can come after." I stopped suddenly, hearing the front door squeak open like a funhouse attraction. "How did you even manage this?" Ulf asked, lifting the lid and peeking at the thing inside. "It's quite impressive. Is that a fox trap you've—" I glanced at the window as he spoke, realizing it had gotten dark while I wasn't paying attention. It wasn't even full dark. The sun was still pink on the horizon, but it seemed that they hadn't waited today. The second the day passed, they decided to attack, and I guess I couldn't blame them. If someone had my brother, I wouldn't waste any time either. I shushed Ulf and hunkered down, both of us taking up our weapons and preparing for battle. Ulf snickered at my bat and hatchet, but I shook my head at him as I watched the door. The sounds of feet were audible on the roof. The group now 10 strong, and they tromped loudly as they made their way to the front of the house. The feet stopped outside the open door as they grouped up, and I heard a new noise then, something like a hound as it sniffed at the base of the door. It got a snoot full of something, too, because it started chattering excitedly as another of the group garbled in that broken language of theirs. "Get up of her," Ulf whispered, cocking an ear and listening to the little monsters talk. "Do you understand any of that?" I asked hopefully. "Some. It's a little like Icelandic, but it's older. I can pick out 1 word in 5, and they don't sound good." I thought about it for a minute, not sure how best to proceed. Do you think you could talk to them?" Ulf thought about it. "Maybe," he hedged, speaking to the door in a rough tongue I'd never heard before. The group on the other side of the door was silent as he spoke to them. They chattered amongst themselves once he was done, their words low and growly, before one of them spoke back to him in kind. The two spoke back and forth for a minute, Ulf not seeming sure of his words, while the lad spoke with confidence. Their words were strange. I was used to Ulf and his odd Icelandic language, 5 parts song and 5 parts growl, but this was different. This sounded like stones grinding together, like ice forming and melting in total silence, of reindeer running along the steppe, and so many other things. I listened in rapt silence, trying to pick up their patter, and when Ulf looked back, he didn't seem happy. I understood about half of what they said, but the gist is that they want their brother back. What's he willing to trade in return? I asked, keeping an elbow on the hooting basket. Nothing. He wants his brother back. That's all he really said. He will trade nothing. He will accept nothing but his brother back. Tell him I'll release his brother if he leaves me alone. I'm tired of them attacking me. I want them to leave me and my family alone. Ulf bit his lip. I'll try. He spoke to the lads for a few minutes, their gravelly voices returning quickly whenever he finished, and he turned back, shaking his head after a few minutes. He just keeps saying the same thing, over and over again. He wants his brother back. Give him his brother back, or they'll come and get him. I gripped the bat tightly. Then they're gonna have to come and get him. They must have understood that one. They screamed in hellish glee as they charged, but Ulf and I were ready. We kicked the door that separated the mudroom from the living room, and they squealed as they hit it. The door started rattling like someone was trying to open it. It would only open inward, though, and Ulf and I both had our backs against it as they started trying to destroy it. They hacked at it brutally, their knives coming down on the wood like gunshots, as the tin set about its destruction. The basket began to cackle loudly as the knives pierced the thick wood, sending shafts of light into the dim room. The little bastards were strong, and I realized I was fighting them at what must have been the height of their power, or near to it. This was Yuletide, their time, and I was trying to fight them when they were arguably at their strongest. Maybe I should have tried to make amends, but it was a little late for that now. Hold on, I yelled, leaving Ulf to set his massive shoulders against the door as I ran back to the bedroom. I came out with the mattress I had tried to block the door with the other day, and Ulf laughed before he winced in pain. One of the knives had slipped through, piercing his shoulder, and when he set his back against the mattress to block the door, the fabric stained a bright red. We both took a corner, leaning into it as the blades kept stabbing into the thick wooden frame. We were pushed mercilessly from the other side, and for creatures the size of children, they were devilishly strong. I could hear the cloth tearing and the springs groaning under the assault, but we held against them nonetheless. It seemed to go on forever, the adrenaline coursing as the two of us held fast. Soldiers often talk about time becoming funny in battle, but I never understood it until I spent time at the mercy of the lads. Sometimes minutes felt like hours. Other times, a whole night could go by in the blink of an eye. It must have been hours, though. It had to be, because I remember well when the pounding stopped. We were slumped, knees against the hardwood, and the lads' knives were still crashing against the makeshift barricade. I could see the light through the fabric on top, the back now little more than tattered rags and damaged wood, and I could hear their knives smacking at the springs as they tried to make their way through the barrier of iron corkscrews. Ulf was winded, his strength deteriorating as the hours went on, and I could feel my own shirt sticking to me despite the cold weather billowing outside. We couldn't last much longer. There was no way we could hold out. We knew it. Then my digital watch chimed midnight, and the thumping stopped. I don't mean it tapered off. I don't mean it slowed to a halt. I mean, it just stopped. Ulf and I looked at each other with suspicion, not sure what game they were playing. I lifted the corner of the mattress and peeked into the mudroom, expecting to have my head taken off. Instead, all I saw was an empty doorway and the hanging remains of my front door. They had just left for no conceivable reason, and I didn't like the look of it. December 23rd. Kretzkoker. Do you see them? Ulf whispered, half gasping as he got to his feet. No, but that hardly means anything. Ulf joined me near the door and looked out into the yard. The snow blew and the wind howled, December in full force raging outside. The trees creaked in the blow, but I was surprised to see not a single footprint in the fresh powder. Small as they were, they should have left some sign of their passing. Ulf bit his lip, just as confused as I was, and when he looked back to me, I could see the uncertainty written across his face. I don't like it. It feels wrong. Why did they just stop? I don't know, but I agree. Something is fishy here. We took some boards and used them to hold the mattress in place, the wind blowing against the house outside and making it groan. The house seemed to sag under the weight of all the silence, the snow creaking on the roof, the wind pushing at the walls. Ulf and I listened for even the slightest sound of lads, but it was as if they had evaporated. We had gone from defending our door with the mattress, knives hitting the springs again and again, to total silence in the course of a few minutes. Should we maybe make a break for it? Ulf asked, the silence rattling him as much as it had me. What if that's their plan? I whispered. What if they want us to think that it's clear, so we'll give up our position of strength? So what? We just stay here till morning? Ulf asked, skeptically. Seems the best course of action. Ulf took a seat on the couch, but it didn't seem to comfort him. His eyes kept straying to the window, the idea of the lad's eyes watching him, making him uncomfortable. I couldn't blame him. Picking my way towards the kitchen, I couldn't help but watch the windows as I made tea. Tea seemed about the only thing I had left in the house, aside from some TV dinners, and it helped calm me down and keep me awake on these long nights. I found myself glancing up at the window every few seconds, wishing I had covered them or something. I expected them to burst open any minute, the lads rolling in on me as they took their terrible revenge, but the waiting was almost worse, despite there being nothing we could do about it. So we waited. It would be hours until dawn. Icelandic sun cycles can put sunrise at 11 a.m. during winter, but that's never seemed to matter to the lads. They had always seemed to leave around morning time, and could appear any time after the sun went down. They didn't seem to have any particular arrival schedule, but I suspected that their departure time was due to children. The Yule lads had always dealt mostly with the schedules of children, you see, leaving gifts and making mischief while the kids were asleep, and it seemed that their antics ended when a child would normally be awake. It didn't seem as hard and fast a rule where I was concerned. They were out for revenge, after all. But something about the true night gave them a sense of power. If we could hold out until morning, we might be okay. We sat near the door with our tea, neither of us feeling comfortable in the living room. Our adrenaline was racing, and our ears were cocked for any sound of approaching elf feet. I was listening for the familiar tap of boots on the floor, the scrape of Patterskfell in his wooden armor, the sniffle of Gettelfur. I heard something now and then, a rustle or a groan from the ceiling outside the room, but with the wind and the snow, it could easily have been the eaves creaking under the weight. I dug in, expecting to be attacked at any minute, but the adrenaline was making Ulf twitchy. Ulf's eyes darted around like a trapped cat, and he seemed in danger of breaking the handle on his axe if he twisted it much harder. I could understand his discomfort. This would be like a murderous Father Christmas coming down the chimney with an axe for me, but it seemed to make him progressively more upset the longer the silence stretched. He was a farmer, a sheep herder. Fighting creatures of Fae was not something he was supposed to be doing. Hell, it wasn't something any of us were supposed to be doing. As the hours ticked by, Ulf began to slip into madness. At 2 a.m., he looked up suddenly, looking out into the hall. We had moved into the bedroom, the lack of windows making us feel a little safer as we guarded Sausage Snatcher. He was snorting softly, grunting every now and again, but he seemed to understand that our time with him was limited. He was uncomfortable, but he would be freed soon, one way or another. Even with all the anxiety and adrenaline pumping through me, I found myself nodding as I listened to the little creature snoring. Ulf, however, seemed immune to all the snoring spells. He started at the door like he wanted to set it on fire, and when he jumped up, I snorted awake violently. Did you hear something? I whispered, gripping my bat tightly. I need something to drink. I blinked at him in surprise. Now? What if they're still out there? I'll take my chances. I can't sit here another minute and listen to this house creak. I'll go good and truly insane if I do. He went through the door slowly and carefully, and I jumped up to try and stop him. Ulf, wait! He was in the hall already, though, slipping along quietly as he tried to look in 4 directions at once. I stopped at the door, my feet refusing to go any further, my body trapped in limbo as I watched Ulf peek around into the living room. He looked to the kitchen, looked to the fireplace, but when he looked to the front door, I saw him linger there. The mattress was gone, simply disappeared, and the door hung open as the snow became small hills on the hay. Ulf had the decency to look remorsefully at me before making a break for the front door. That's when I heard him gag and watched his body come up short as he came even with the couch. That galvanized me, and I ran from the room to try to help him. He just stood there amidst the hay and the ruins of my traps, looking like a fish on a hook for all intents and purposes. It would prove to be a fitting analogy. As I came closer, I realized that stand was the wrong word. Ulf's feet were twitching, his toes jumping on the floor like he was having a fit. His arms jerked like he was in shock, and I realized what he looked like a moment before I saw the thread. They should have been visible. I should have been able to see the hundreds of translucent strands that hung from the ceiling, each ending in a silvery hook with a brutal tip. He had been pierced over a dozen times, maybe even 24, and they stuck into him like bee stingers. He shook a little as the blood oozed down his front, and when he turned, I could see that a few of them had found their way into his face. His features were a rictus of pain, and I thought Ulf looked like a puppet who's just noticed his strings. When he was jerked into the rafters, the axe spilling from his fingers to clunk to the floor, I heard the lads giggling and knew we had been tricked. I looked up into the shadows, wanting to help him, but I couldn't think of any way to get up there to him. I could see all the hooks around me, my eyes finally seeing them now that I was aware of them, and as their boots thunked above me, I ran back to the hallway so they couldn't simply fall on my head. The basket I'd slung under my arm, my constant albatross, began to shake violently, and I almost dropped it as the little creature tried to take advantage of my distraction. I couldn't fight them, and keep hold of Sausage Snatcher, and I feared that if I let him escape, I'd never see Ulf again. I hated myself for being a coward, but the only way to help Ulf was to stay alive. I ran back to the bedroom and braced the door, the wood little more than Swiss cheese now, and the stacked furniture, keeping out anything that might try to stab its way through. I took the basket, its inhabitant laughing maniacally, and got into the farthest corner I could. I couldn't help Ulf. He was with the lads now. But if I could hold on to this little goblin, maybe I could still get him back. The laughter from the wicker prison was making me crazy, and I kicked out at him as I put my head against my knees and tried not to lose my mind. Watching my best friend get pierced with hooks and dragged into the rafters wasn't great for my mental health. As the minutes passed and my breathing reached something like normal, I decided it was time to go bargain. I walked out into the hall, basket under my arm, and called out to them. "This has gone on long enough. I'm ready to make a deal, but only if my friend is still alive." As if they'd been waiting for me, there was a note hanging from one of the hooks, written in perfect English, in an immaculate hand. "Meet us by the scorched tree at midnight. Come alone, or your friend stays with us. Regards, Keta Snicker." Hey folks, Dr. Plague here. Just popping in to say thanks for spending your holiday season with me. I know the holidays are a little hectic, trust me, I'm well aware of that. And to have you come back every night to hear my stories just really warms my heart. I really appreciate all the warmth and kindness that you guys give me in my comment section, and I couldn't think of a better Christmas present than having all of you here to listen to the last night of the Yule Lad stories. Yep, here we are on the final 13th day of Christmas. So, sit back, relax, and enjoy the last episode of the Yule Lads. December 24th, Kurtisniker. The wind was howling like an angry animal as I dragged myself and my wicker basket to the scorched trees the next night. The snow blew, the flurries fell, and the ground crunched underfoot as my thick boots came down through the crust of ice. Sausage Snatcher thrashed in the basket as we went, trying to make my progress harder, but I was set on my destination. Ulf was waiting for me in the burnt-out ruins at the edge of the farm, and I was going to get him back. Arnar had found me that morning, processing what was going on. Ulf never came back last night. I nodded, too tired and too numb to do much else. He came here to help you. It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. Is he dead? I looked up, surprised. Of course not. Your son is made of sterner stuff than that. Arnar nodded, but seemed relieved nonetheless. They have him, then. I'll get him back, I answered, already realizing that I'd travel to hell and back and fight all the little goblins, if it meant getting Ulf back. Arnar raised an eyebrow. And what might you have that the lads would want? I nudged my basket with a boot, and it started kicking and cursing as Sausage Snatcher tried to free himself. One of their own. I expected the old farmer to get angry when he realized what was in the little cage. He would say that he had told me not to cross Fae, and ask what I had done. I had trapped one and held it prisoner. I expected him to reprimand me, threaten to put me out, maybe even knock me out and try to bargain with them for his son's return. Arnar was of the land, after all. It wouldn't be outside the realm of thought that he might know a way to contact the Fae, just for misunderstandings like this. Instead, he surprised me by laughing in that deep, rich way that he had. I knew you Englishmen were capable of getting sand in your craw, but my God, boy, have they agreed to a meeting. I showed him the note, and he sucked in a breath as he read it. That place. I figured they would want to meet there. Why? What's so special about it? Did Ulf never tell you about his forebear, Gorl? I looked down at the axe that sat between my legs. It was all Ulf had left behind when they took him, and I hadn't known how heavy it was until I tried to pick it up. Ulf had carried it in one hand, but I would have likely been overbalanced if I tried to swing it with both. It felt old, even though I'd seen the handle replaced not 10 years ago. It was a relic out of time, something that had spilled Fae blood before, if the legends were to be believed. Maybe it would again. He mentioned it. He said he fought Fae a long time ago, before the farm was founded. Arnar nodded. This land was once occupied by a different family, an old family that held the Fae in their regard. Gorl and his men burned them out, taking their land as was custom back then. Those were different times. That was how things were done. But the Fae didn't like it. They tried to drive him out, but Gorl was made of stronger stuff. He held his own, burning their grove and sent them fleeing to the next holdout. The scorched trees are all that's left of that grove, and none of Gorl's children have dared return to that place since he passed. I have to go there. He stood with me. I won't repay him by leaving him to his fate. Arnar nodded. We'll keep an eye on Davin. Take that axe with you when you go. Maybe it will do you some good. More good than it did him. The axe was hanging from my belt now. I hoped I wouldn't have to use it, but nothing lately had been easy. I was physically exhausted, my body ready to drop, but I had to get to the grove before midnight. If they arrived before I did, they might take Ulf and then leave. Then I would never find him again. If this struggling little bastard could get Ulf back, I would consider it an even trade, no matter what happened afterwards. Once I traded my bargaining chip, I didn't figure I'd live to see New Year's. I'd spent the day trying to sleep, trying to rest, but my overcomplicated mind returned to things again and again. Whenever I would slip off for even a minute, I would see the axe falling to the ground and watch Ulf get pulled into the ceiling by the laughing little devils. Then I'd come screaming awake as I tried to grab him. I had managed maybe an hour, my mind screaming at me to lie back down as I put on my pants and boots and prepared to leave for the meeting. After this was all over, I'd probably sleep for a week straight, but tonight I had work to do. I could see the scorched tree rising like a skeletal finger amongst the stumps. The area around the tree was strange, always chilling, and it was the only place clear of snow. Snow didn't gather here. Animals didn't gather here. Nothing but dead grass and stumps gathered here. The thought that Ulf's forebears would have burned these trees was unthinkable. Trees were rare in Iceland. More than 3 trees clustered together was an anomaly, and Iceland isn't exactly known for its thick forests. As I got closer, I saw a small, well-dressed figure sitting on the remains of the tree. The little creature was the antithesis of his brothers. He wore an immaculate red coat, a vest with gold buttons, trim black slacks, and a monocle that looked out of place on his toadish face. He reminded me of a banker. His few hairs swooped back, and his facial hair was cut almost invisibly. His frightful appearance, though, made the suit look alien. "Ah," he said, pulling out his pocket watch on a long chain as he checked the time. "Early for all that. Punctuality is not a trait I am accustomed to in your kind." His voice was rich and cultured, and he spoke English to my astonishment. "Are you Kurtznicker?" "Yes, indeed. It seems you have something that we want. When one of your kind wants something from one of my kind, I am the lad to broker such a deal." He grinned at me, but his pointy teeth did not present anything close to reassurance. "I must say, given what I've seen of your brothers, you are a surprise." He smiled again. "As the Yule lad responsible for stealing candles, something that was quite a sought-after commodity when I first began, I found that sometimes it's best to develop a hook. People are more willing to trust a traveler on the road, a stranger on his own, maybe even a lost child. Someone who looks like me and sounds like my brothers isn't going to get very far in this world." "Speaking of my brothers," he said, segueing into the heart of the matter, "where is dear old Brugnekeiger?" I lifted the basket, but it was pretty clear that he could hear the awful little creature kicking around inside. "Where's my brother?" I asked, answering him with a question of my own. He sighed. "Straight to it, then." He whistled, and I saw a group of 11 marching someone with a bag on their head out of the snow. How had I missed him? Ulf was closer to 7 foot than 6, and his clothes were stained with red runners of blood. He didn't fight his captors as they let him out either. His head was bent, and he was silent all the way. "Take off the hood," I barked, not trusting this Ulf for a second. I had grown up on stories of changelings, and this smacked of a double cross. Ulf was not precisely the target demographic for changelings, but they might have employed one nonetheless. The last thing I needed was a member of the Fae in the Longhouse, or the wrath of Arnar when his prized son was lost. Kurtisnicker rolled his eyes dramatically. "Such theatrics! Why would I bring you the wrong human?" "Because it's the sort of thing that fairies do." He wrinkled his nose at the word, but said something to Patricksfell in the odd language of theirs. The little armored lad used his hook to snatch the bag off of Ulf's head, and I winced as I saw Ulf's beaten face. His eyes moved around widely, both swollen into raccoon pits, and when they fell on me, he grinned in a gap-toothed way. He looked terrible, his face a lumpy mash of bruises and swollen flesh. Some of his teeth were broken, some of them were missing, but he smiled grotesquely, regardless of the pain it caused him. "Frady, thank God. I wasn't sure you would make the trade with these little rats for me." I looked at Kurtisnicker. "What the hell did you animals do to him?" He only shrugged. "He resisted, very strenuously. My brothers do not possess the same restraint that I do, and they became tired of his antics. I doubt my brother has suffered any less at your hands." "Prick his finger," I said, some of the smile sliding off of Ulf's face. Kurtisnicker produced a stiletto from his belt, something that had started life as a letter opener, I had no doubt. He pricked Ulf's finger, and squeezed a few drops of the big man's blood out as he squirmed. He invited me to have a closer look then. In the light of the moon, it was hard to tell. All blood looks black under the moon. But in the light of my flashlight, I could see his blood was red as it trickled into the snow. If it bleeds red, it's usually human. Sorry, I had to be sure. Ulf nodded. I'd have done the same. Can't be too careful with the Fae. Now then, since you've seen that we do indeed have your brother, maybe you could show us that you have ours. I took the top off the basket, spilling the little creature out onto the burnt earth, trap and all. His brothers made to approach, but I brought out the axe and held it close to the prone lad. I did not have Ulf, and I was not about to take chances. He slumped in his trap, the other lads chuckling at his plump, greasy form as he sat there looking rumpled and unhappy. Curtis-Sneaker shook his head at the little fellow and looked up to me with a spread of his hands. So, do we have a deal? Cut him loose. I'll need his help to free this one, I said, tapping Sausage Snatcher with my boot. The immaculate little goblin waggled a finger at me. And if you two go running back to your home? There's 12 of you. I figure you can catch 2 humans in the snow if you really need to. Curtis-Sneaker laughed. You are correct, of course. He turned to the other lads and spoke in that weird guttural language of theirs. One of them cut Ulf free and shoved his legs as he tumbled towards me. I bent to the trap, not making eye contact with the lads as I waved Ulf over to help. The 2 of us pulled the teeth apart, the hinges a little stiff from being closed for so long, and Sausage Snatcher zipped out as soon as the teeth were wide enough for him to pass. He eagerly joined his brothers, seemingly none the worse for wear, despite having been in the trap for 4 days. Curtis-Sneaker turned to go, his brothers already leaving, but I had one more question for him. So when will you all be back? He wrinkled his deformed brow, looking more like a gremlin from the movie. Pardon? I've traded away my bargaining chip, so I'm asking when you and your brothers are going to come back for me. He laughed again, but it was a malicious sound now, devoid of the warmth that had been there before, if ever it had been. Fear not, man-thing. I've taken the last of your treasures as of tonight, so we'll consider your little mistake paid for. What? I asked, taking a step towards him. What are you talking about? How much do you know about me? He asked indulgently. You're the candle stealer. You steal candles from people, right? He seemed to think about that before he answered. That's true, technically. But since the invention of electricity, candles are a bit hard to come by. Mother's always hated them anyway. The wax gets ground up in her teeth, don't you know? Unlike many Fae, sometimes we Yule lads have to adapt a bit to keep ourselves relevant. Now I wonder, do you know what my mother loves to eat? Ulf sucked in a breath, but I only shook my head as the wind whistled around us. Children. Children are Mother's very favorite food in the entire world. That's why, not to toot my own horn, I am her very favorite amongst all her boys. Because what is a child but the light of a household? The ice running in my veins had nothing to do with the weather. I felt like someone had slugged me in the guts. I'm sorry to say that while you prepared to rescue one brother, you quite neglected another. He's a little old for our mother's taste. She prefers them still smelling of the womb, but I dare say that he'll make a fine offering. Our business has concluded. Have a very merry Yule, he said, tipping into a little bow. I charged him, not giving a damn what followed, but as my hands clamped on his arm, he turned into mist before my eyes. He smiled as he disappeared, his teeth white and perfect and absolutely terrifying in their certainty. I shouted into the winter wind, voicing my impotent rage. As the creature disappeared back into nothing, Ulf tried to console me, but I brushed him off and started running for the longhouse. It couldn't be. It just couldn't be. Arnor's house was safe. His house was a refuge from the winter and the problems of the world. I came onto the porch quite suddenly, not sure how I had gotten there. Everything moved in a blur. The world like a shot in a movie where the camera runs on tracks. Sigrun came out of the kitchen, but I flew past her as I ran for the back room. He'd be there, snug in bed and safe, and I'd be able to laugh at how the old goblin had gotten one last jab in at me. The cold air hit my face when I opened the door, and my stomach dropped when I saw the bed. The only thing in it was Grendel's yowling form, his leg bleeding again. He had tried to pull himself out of his convalescence bed. He tried to go after them when they took Davin, and as he moved pathetically on the coverlet, he looked out the window as the cold snow blew back in his face. Davin was gone. I've been sitting on the bed, petting and trying to console the Black Tom for nearly an hour. I know what I have to do, but I don't know how to begin. The legends are very clear on who their mother is and where she resides. Grella and her husband, Le Paludi, live in their cave in the Dimmelborgu lava fields, or so the legend says. He may already be dead for all I know, but I can't just leave him there. I'm going to find him, even if it kills me. Merry Christmas, everyone. It's Dr. Plague popping in real quick to tell you that this is, in fact, the last in the Yule Lads' diaries. I just wanted to thank all of you for joining me for all 14 nights. As you know, some of my stories go on a little longer than expected. I'm so appreciative that you've made me a part of your family and a part of your household during the holidays, and I hope you'll continue to do so in the new year. Alright, without further ado, here's the Yule Lads' diaries, part 14. Enjoy! December 25th. Grella and the Yule Cat. We're here, Ulf slurred, and I shook myself awake. We'd been driving for nearly 4 hours, the roads only passable because of Ulf's jeep. When we came to the field, my head felt light and puffy from sleep. I had slept nearly the whole way here, only waking when jounced or when something drugged me up to be seen. I'd been to the lava fields before. They were a great source of beauty and were an enjoyable study for someone not accustomed to seeing lava outside of television. The heat shimmer off the area, the underground flows and the geysers, keeping the snow away and the area unseasonably warm. I almost didn't want to venture in. As beautiful as it was, it held a deep sense of foreboding as well. There were monsters here, monsters older than the grove, and as the hot air blew in my face, I thought again about turning around. Davin could be dead. He could be bones in a stew pot. But I needed to bury those bones, if that was the case. I wouldn't leave him in this place to die alone. Arnar had tried to talk me out of it. "It's too dangerous, boy," he said as I got my bag ready. "He's my brother. I have to get him. Same as Ulf." He could be dead already. I had turned to glower at him, but I found only concern on his lined face. "Please, boy, I know you want him back, but I can't stand to lose both of you. If it were Ulf, wouldn't you go?" He sighed, looking hopeless, but I could see the pride in there as well. "How will you get there? You're dead on your feet." "I'll take him," Ulf slurred, stepping out of the kitchen with his mother trailing behind him. "You'll do no such thing," Sigrun hissed. "You're too beaten up. Ulf, you need to rest and heal, as do you," she said, turning on me with clear disapproval. "If I don't go, Davin's dead," I said, knowing I was going even if I had to walk the whole way. "And I will drive him," Ulf finished. Sigrun made as though to object, but Ulf put a hand out to stop her. "Mother, I can assure you that driving is all I intend to do. I wouldn't set foot in back that place if it meant all 3 of your lives." He looked over at me, and I saw shame and pity written loud across his face. "Sorry, Frady. I want to go there with you. I want to prove that I'm worthy to stand in battle with you. But I can't go back to that place. If you had been there in Grella's home, the Yule Cat glaring his fiery eyes at you, and the lads constantly terrorizing you, the smell of cooking meat and a constant wafting fog, you wouldn't go either." I spent the day with them, but they will haunt my nights for the rest of my life. This is all I can do for you, and this is all I can give to you." He handed me the axe, the one I had dropped on the ground as I ran for the longhouse. I tried to refuse it, but he shook his head and pressed it into my hand. "Gorl once used it to fight against the Fae. Maybe it will help you when you see the horrors I was subjected to." I thanked him, but he shook his head, wishing he could do more. Sigrun packed us a lunch. Arnar brought me a backpack with some basic supplies in it. Ropes and lanterns, a first aid kit, some iron nails, and a bag of iron shavings he'd collected from his shop. He thought maybe they could help, given Fairy's hatred of iron, and I strapped the axe to the bag as I prepared to go. Grendel yowled pitifully as he came shakily out, clearly wanting to go too, but I couldn't possibly take the cat with me in his current state. "Stay with Sigrun," I told him, stroking the poor cat as he tried to take agonizing step after agonizing step. "I'll bring him back. I promise." He looked at me nakedly, Sigrun picking him up gently as she cradled him close. We had left then, my eyes slipping shut before the jeep even got on the road. Now here I was, standing in the balmy air of the lava fields, preparing to head into the den of Grella, the Yule lads, and the Yule cat. Strangely, I wasn't as nervous as I should have been. "If I'm not back in a few hours, go home, Ulf. If I can't get him out before nightfall, assume I'm dead." Ulf shook his head. "I'll stay the night, at the very least. I hope to see you coming over that ridge before it gets good and dark, though." He hugged me then, not something he often did, and when he let go, I saw him think hard about going with me again. He seemed to want to be by my side, but his feet stopped working about 3 steps from the jeep. I couldn't imagine what he had suffered at the hands of the lads and their ilk, but I supposed I wouldn't have as hard a time imagining it after a few minutes. I thumped his shoulder and left, neither of us saying that we doubted we'd ever see each other again. I hiked through the basin for about an hour before I found the cave. The fields aren't hard to navigate, not really. You avoid the lava flows, you watch your step for vents or other pitfalls, and you keep your eyes peeled for caves. The place was supposed to be connected to Iceland's infernal regions. After spending some time here, I could see why the earlier inhabitants had believed so. The place was stifling, the caves and crevices looking like some great evil force had warped them, and as the vents belched scalding air that you could get third-degree burns from, I felt certain that nothing could live here. When I saw the massive footprint in the rock, I knew that something must. The cave had been easy to find after I found the first footprint. Something huge had crunched down hard enough on the rock to leave a series of large indents that were nearly 4 feet long. I didn't really want to meet whatever had made those tracks, but I knew they were most likely to belong to the thing I was looking for. I had to find a way over 2 lava flows, something the makers of these prints didn't seem to have a problem with. But eventually, I came to the mouth of an ugly old cave that seemed to go straight down. It gaped like an angry mouth as it hung open in the earth. Whatever lived here also didn't seem to have a problem with the drop. I tossed a rock into the gaping passage, and I counted to 8 before I heard it hit the ground. I was thankful for the rope, and as I secured one of the ring bolts to the ledge, I began to descend into the darkness. I had gone down about 20 feet when I realized I could smell something that permeated the air. It smelled like roasting meat, and it was not very pleasant in its consistency. I could see, too. There was a dim light cast by the rocks down here, and if I was careful, I might not trip in a hole and die. When I reached the bottom, I found myself standing outside a cave that seemed to hold a large kitchen. It was the last thing I had expected to find down here, and it almost got me spotted before I could process it. A giant creature was moving about in the dim light, stirring pots and dropping things into them, grumbling in a low way that made me think it might be humming. A huge stone stove glowed with an inner fire, big wooden pots and bowls that it used to cook and hold ingredients it was using. a giant stone knife that came down hard enough to separate whatever it was making into smaller pieces. The creature itself was hunched, string hair hanging around its face like a cloud, and its lumpy head looked like a badly carved jack-o'-lantern. It swung about, casting lamp-like eyes on whatever it was cooking, and dumping things into a pot on the stove with a methodical rapidity that spoke of repetition over a lifetime. If you've ever seen the show Fraggle Rock, it was very much like being in the Gorg's kitchen, and I suddenly understood why the Fraggles were so afraid of them. The lumpy creature was nearly 20 feet tall and almost half that wide. It wore a dumpy potato sack covered in flour and worse things, if those red stains were what I thought they were. Its arms seemed too long and its legs too short, its disproportionate body making up most of the creature's height. It hadn't seen me yet. I was thankfully too small to be noticed, but it turned suddenly and sneezed hard enough to knock me down as a wave of stinking air hit me like a fist. I'd gotten a look at its mouth as it opened, and I didn't want a closer look at those crooked teeth or gaping maw. This had to be Grella. As she went back to work, hunched over the preparation area, I snuck into the kitchen on tiptoes. Keeping the table between us, I slunk along the stony surface and made my way to the opposite opening. Her chopping sent vibrations through the stone, and it sounded like she was breaking rocks rather than cutting food. I was aware of another sound, a crunching, splattery sound that I couldn't quite understand until it was thrust into my face. I was hunkered beside the table in the middle of the kitchen, waiting for the perfect time to run, when the knife swung up and tossed something back at me. It smacked me in the face, and as I staggered back, I had to slap a hand over my mouth to stop from shouting in surprise. The lamplight eyes came back as my feet scuffed the stone, and I threw myself behind the table as those eyes fell on the spot where I had been. I was glad for the hand over my mouth when I came face to face with the object, because if I hadn't, I would have been unable to stop myself from screaming. It was a finger. I stood frozen for a few seconds as I processed the information. She was carving up bodies. Not just bodies. Children's bodies, I had no doubt. Hadn't Candle Stealer told me as much? Hadn't he said that she preferred children? Hell, she preferred babies by his words. She was making a stew, and the smell in the air that filled my nostrils as I drifted amongst the smoke on my way down made me nauseous. I had to lock my fingers to stop from vomiting, and the halt in progress probably saved my life. Another set of thunderous footsteps shook the counter as a large creature of similar origin came lumbering through the doorway, the very one that I had been making for. It yelled at her in that strange guttural way that the lad spoke, and she shouted back in kind. I peeked around the edge of the table, watching as she brandished the stone knife at him and pointed back the way he had come. He blustered at her, but she was having none of it. I didn't have to speak the language to know what was happening here. He grabbed something on the counter, probably the arm the finger had belonged to, and she sliced at him with that hellish cleaver as he came too close. They began to fight, punching and screaming and rolling around the place. As they rolled a few feet from my hiding place, I dashed for the opening he'd come from. Whatever lay beyond had to be better than this. I sat in the semi-darkness, and I could see the room beyond was filled with looming rock edifices. They were arranged in such a way that I thought they might be some kind of sitting room, but it was too dark to make out more than shadowy formations. I glanced back as I ran, certain that they would have seen me, but their fight raged on behind me. I could still hear them grunting and thumping as they grappled, rolling around the kitchen as the sounds of fists hitting flesh echoed off the walls. I breathed a sigh of relief as I realized that they were way too busy to be bothered with me, and I started to think that maybe this wouldn't be as hard as I'd thought. Maybe I'd be allowed to find Davin and leave before we were noticed. Maybe this would succeed, and I'd be allowed to walk away with my little brother in tow. That's when I stepped down into a pit in the rocks and fell face first into a mound of bristly black fur. I stumbled back, falling on my butt as I landed on a burlap blanket that had been put down next to a soaring stone chair. The fur ball began to disentangle itself, its angry yellow eyes like a pair of searchlights, as it rose like a specter before me. Its fur was black and matted, and I could smell a distinct aroma of gore. Its mouth was locked in an eternal growl, its teeth too big for its jaws as it grinned horrifically at me. Its ears were little more than nubs that sat atop its midnight black head, its paws the size of a bear's, and its claws slid freely as it padded curiously towards me. It yowled in its throat, a sound like a sick emergency siren, and it seemed to be rising into a throaty explosion of sound and fury as its curiosity became anger. As I watched him rise up, I realized I knew him. How could I not? He was almost as well known as the lads themselves. Sigrun had sewn samplers of him hanging over her fireplace. The stories of him were often told around the fire during the winter months, and I could still remember the first time I'd heard it from Arnar as the wind blew and the snow swirled outside the windows. As it prepared to leap on me, hunkering for a pounce, I closed my eyes and prepared to be devoured by none other than the freaking Yule cat. "Hey, knock it off," someone said from the folds of burlap. "It might be another kid." The cat turned its head and meowed deeply, its voice sounding like a rock slide. A small form crawled out from across the burlap creases to scratch its whiskers, holding none of my fear for the massive creature. The kid took the cat's massive head and scratched under its chin as he talked in that nonsense way that people often do with cats, and the coal-black devil purred in pleasure. The byplay was so familiar that I think I recognized him before I saw him. How many times had I seen him do just that same thing with Grendel as the two sat on the couch together? Davin moved away from the big cat and was nearly standing on my feet when he recognized me. He was filthy, looking like he'd been living in a chimney, but his grin was ear to ear as he threw his arms around me and buried his face in my chest. I couldn't feel his tears through my thick ski jacket, but I knew that he was crying. He had likely thought that he would never see me again, never see Arnar or Olaf or Sigrun or anyone ever again, and his joy was a palpable thing. I found myself sniffing too, hugging him back as we stood under the curious gaze of the Yule cat, who seemed to be trying to decide if I was hurting Davin or not. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again. How did you get here?" he asked, lifting his face to look at me, the tears having cleaned grime from his face in shiny rivulets. "Ulf brought me. You didn't think I'd just leave you here, did you?" He shrugged. "I wasn't sure you would come back from your meeting. When I woke up in a cage in this thing's basement, I figured they had double-crossed you and you were probably dead. There are a lot of children down there. At least there were. She came a few hours ago and started throwing open cages and putting them in a sack. Sometimes she would smash the sack against a wall or onto the floor, and they would stop squirming until she put a few more in there. I knew I didn't want that, so I dug out from under the wall of my cage and hid in the fireplace until she left. The flue went up to the one in the living room here, but I saw the other one sleeping when I came out. I tried to sneak past him, but that's when he found me," he said, putting a hand on that fearsome feline so it could rub its nose against his hand. "And how did you two come to be such fast friends?" I asked, not sure about the massive creature. Tavin shrugged. "Same as it was with Grendel, I guess. He hissed a little, but then decided that he liked me. After that, we were just friends." I didn't have time to ponder this turn of events. I only thought about how our chances were better of escaping with the help of this monster cat. "Davin, we need to get back to the opening I came in through. Can he help us?" Davin looked at the creature, and I swear it nodded its shaggy head in affirmation. It started to walk towards the kitchen, looking back as it left the crevice to see if we were following. "Come on, we need to stay close," Davin said, taking my hand and dragging me up beside the huge black creature. We followed in its wake, our feet visible from beneath it, but the rest of us hidden by the thick, shaggy coat. He didn't seem to mind when Davin grabbed him by the fur, and as I set my own hands, I thought he felt a bit like a ratty old teddy who needs a wash. When we entered the kitchen, I could see that Grella was back to chopping up pieces of flesh, and the other one sat grumpily by the prep table. His face was bruised and puffy, but he seemed none the worse for wear as he waited patiently for dinner. Grella stirred the pot with a giant wooden spoon and looked at the cat as he crossed the kitchen. As large as the cat was, the monstrous woman was larger still. She made enticing noises to the cat as he walked past, and he looked at her as he seemed to contemplate going to his mistress. He meowed, clearly torn, until Davin spoke quietly in his ear, and the cat walked away instead, giving us safe passage across the kitchen. I sighed in relief, the fickle loyalty of cats being known, but stopped short as her thunderous footsteps echoed across the kitchen. She came up beside the cat, towering over him as though he were no more than a baby, and he looked back at her with mistrust. She brought a hand down under his middle, the cat looking back as she lifted him into her arms, and I could hear her cooing to the fell cat as she stroked him. Davin and I could do little else but stand there as our cover was yanked up by the round belly, though it seemed her attention was all for the ebony beastie. She fawned over the cat, the other one making disapproving noises as she lavished the Yule cat with her attention. He used it as a cover to creep closer to the prep table, but not stealthily enough. Grella snapped at him, starting to put the cat back down, and it looked like we might make it out unseen. Then she caught sight of Davin and I, and the three of us just stood there, staring at each other. We stood there for a few deep breaths, our eyes locked in fear, as each of us waited for the first one to make a move. She dropped the cat and darted a hand at me, but the cat moved to try to cover Davin. I had wrapped my hand around the axe handle, even as the cat was ascending skyward, and I swung out with it as the horrific hand came down to grab me. Blood splashed my face, black and tarry, and her fingertip came with it as she reeled back, howling. The other was up now, coming to see what was going on, but I never gave him a chance to join. Davin and I ran as Grella howled, the Yule cat standing like a statue as he watched us. I pulled off the backpack and looked for the sack, hoping that it was still there as I pushed Davin towards the rope. He jumped up and began to climb, but I could already hear the thunderous footsteps behind us as Grella or her mate gave chase. I found the sack, leaving the backpack where it lay as I thrust the bag into my pocket and climbed furiously. I had never been a strong climber, but the incentive to reach the top before the angry monster caught me gave me new purpose as I swung up the rope. Davin was climbing fast, but it wasn't a quick climb, and I knew we wouldn't make it to the top before she caught us. Grella's face was a livid mask as she came into the little room, her fingers still dribbling blood. She stormed towards us, hands outreached, and I shoved one hand into my pocket as I pulled the cord with my teeth to open it. She came even with me, hand outstretched to grab me, and I found her fingers encircling me even as I dumped the bag of iron scraps into her hand, tossing the rest into her stunned face. Her skin began to blister, crackling like a burn victim, and as the shavings hit her face, she screamed and slapped both grotesque hands over her eyes and mouth. Her high-pitched screams rumbled through the cave, and I let them spur me on to new speeds as I climbed for the entrance. She wailed the whole way up, but when the rope wasn't unceremoniously yanked down, I knew that we were home free. When we came out into the setting sun, we both ran onto the field and didn't stop until Ulf's Jeep was close enough to touch. When we saw him running to meet us, his face filled with disbelieving joy, I fell on the hardpack and laughed as I sucked in lungfuls of happy air. It seemed I had managed to do the impossible. I had snatched my brother from the jaws of the Fae and come back to tell the tale. Epilogue. That was 5 years ago, and Davin's first Christmas in Iceland has become the stuff of Christmas legend. We still live on Arnar's farm, and Davin is growing larger than Ulf. When I came back from the lava fields with him, both of us shaken and injured, we became something akin to heroes in their eyes. We had done deeds spoken of in heroes' tales, and all with only an ancient axe and some help from an ill-tempered hellcat. Speaking of hellcats, I don't think anyone was gladder to see us return than Grendel. He didn't leave Davin's arms for the next week, and seemed to have decided that I was one of the few exceptions for decent humans. I returned Arnar's axe, and it still sits above the mantel, hopefully undisturbed forever. Sigrun and Arnar held a feast to celebrate our return, and many of the farmhands approached us to say that they were sorry for the way they had treated us, and how wrong they had been. I'm the farm's chief herdsman now, Davin my assistant, and Ulf will formally inherit the farm in a few years when his da retires to take his leisure. Grendel still sleeps on the hearth when he isn't sleeping in Davin's lap, and he's grown quite fat and amiable in his old age. Life on the farm is as idyllic as ever, and I'm glad that Davin gets to see how I fell in love with the land that's so different from our native Wales. He will grow up unrecognizable from the other lads, and no one will question whether he is of the land, as they did before my little trip to hell and back. One other thing has changed since we came back, though, and I can't say that it's a change for the worse. No one has been troubled by the lads since I grabbed Davin from their clutches. Not a lamb has gone missing, not a cow has been mysteriously injured, not a door has slammed, unless someone slammed it, and no one's food has mysteriously gone missing, unless Ulf ate it. The lads don't come to the farm to leave coins or potatoes or anything. I think they know that this is not their place, and they know well enough to stay away. And it's a fact that lets me sleep soundly when the days grow shorter and the nights seem to last for days. So if you come to this land expecting an easy life, think again. The winters are harsh and the going is tough, but the people are hardy and willing to be neighborly. Just remember, this land is old, and the things that live here are older still. This is not a land of Merry Christmases or festive holidays, though there is certainly cheer here. This is the land of Yule, a place that celebrates the old ways. And if you settle here, it's best to let the lads have their fun, lest you find yourself descending into hell to find what they may have stolen from you as well.